Hi everyone, welcome to Midnight Cases. I know you can't sleep, so I'll keep you company with crime stories from around the world. Before we get into the story, comment where you're listening from. And if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. A story that will haunt you. A story that shows the terrifying depths of human behavior. This is the case of Harold Shipman, a trusted doctor who became Britain's most prolific serial killer. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in Nottingham, England, into a working-class family. His father worked long hours as a truck driver, while his mother Vera ruled the household with fierce ambition. Vera was a domineering woman who instilled in young Harold the belief that he was special, different from other children, destined for greater things. She pushed him relentlessly in his studies and made him feel superior to his peers, creating an isolated boy who struggled to form friendships. Harold was a diligent student, but not exceptionally gifted. Other children found him strange and aloof. He carried himself with an air of superiority that kept him isolated throughout his childhood. His mother's approval became the central focus of his existence. Then tragedy struck. When Harold was 17, his beloved mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease progressed rapidly, and Harold became deeply involved in her care. He would rush home from school to be at her side, watching as the family doctor made regular visits to administer morphine injections that would temporarily ease her terrible suffering. Harold observed these visits closely, noting how his mother's face would relax after the injection, how the morphine would transport her from agony to peaceful relief. He saw the power the doctor wielded, the ability to control pain and comfort with a simple injection. His mother's death devastated Harold. He had lost the person whose love and approval had defined his entire sense of worth. Psychological experts would later theorize that his future behavior represented a twisted attempt to recreate those final months, to place himself in the role of the powerful doctor who controlled life and death. Despite his grief, Harold continued his education and earned a place at medical school. At university, he met Primrose, and when she became pregnant, they married quickly. Harold qualified as a doctor and began working as a general practitioner. From the outside, his life appeared conventional. But within just a few years, serious problems emerged. Harold's partners became suspicious about his frequent requests for large quantities of pethidine, a powerful painkiller. Investigation revealed he had been forging prescriptions to feed his own drug addiction. He was convicted of forgery and drug offenses, fined, and temporarily removed from the medical register. After rehabilitation, Harold convinced authorities he deserved a second chance and was allowed to return to medical practice. Harold sought a fresh start in Hyde, a small town in Greater Manchester. He joined a local medical practice and quickly established himself as hard-working and dedicated. He became particularly popular with elderly patients who appreciated his willingness to make house calls and his patient, caring manner. He projected an image of old-fashioned medical care that had become rare. Behind this benevolent facade, something deeply disturbing was taking place. Harold Shipman began to kill his patients. His method was coldly efficient. He would target elderly patients, usually women living alone, who trusted him completely. He would visit them at their homes, often when no one else was present. During these visits, he would administer a lethal injection of diamorphine. The drug would cause the victim to slip into unconsciousness and then respiratory failure, leading to death within minutes. After killing his victim, Harold would often sit with the body to establish a time of death that aligned with his cover story. He would then inform relatives that the patient had died peacefully. Because he was the doctor, because he was trusted, and because his victims were elderly people for whom death was not entirely unexpected, his word was rarely questioned. Harold would complete the death certificate himself, attributing death to natural causes such as heart failure or stroke. Death certificates signed by a doctor were generally accepted without further investigation. This systemic weakness gave Harold tremendous freedom to kill without detection. For nearly 2 decades, Harold killed without being caught. Investigators would later estimate he murdered approximately 250 patients, making him one of history's most prolific serial killers. His victims were predominantly elderly women with some existing health conditions, making sudden death seem plausible. Some experts believe Harold killed for the sense of power and control it gave him. By deciding who lived and died, he elevated himself to godlike status. Others point to his relationship with his mother in those final months of her illness. Perhaps in killing elderly women in the manner he chose, Harold was unconsciously reenacting those scenes from his youth, but this time he was the powerful doctor administering the injection. He was in control. The beginning of the end came when Harold killed Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress who was healthy and active in her community. Harold signed her death certificate and pushed for quick cremation. However, Kathleen's daughter Angela was a solicitor trained to notice irregularities. She became deeply suspicious when she discovered her mother's will had been recently changed to leave everything to Harold Shipman. The will was obviously forged, poorly typed on Harold's own typewriter. Angela reported her suspicions to police. When investigators exhumed Kathleen's body, it contained massive amounts of morphine. She had been murdered. As the investigation expanded, detectives examined other deaths under Harold's care and discovered his patient death rate was significantly higher than other local doctors. More bodies were exhumed, revealing case after case of morphine poisoning following the same pattern. Harold was arrested and charged with multiple murders. Throughout his trial, he maintained his innocence, showing no remorse or emotion. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, bodies showing lethal drug levels, Harold's presence at the time of death, his control over death certificates, and a forged will. The defense had no credible explanation. The jury found Harold guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, describing the murders as wicked and evil betrayals of trust. Harold showed no emotion as he was led away to prison. A massive public inquiry later concluded he had killed approximately 250 patients over his career. The case exposed serious failures in medical oversight, leading to significant reforms in British medical practice. Several years into his sentence, Harold Shipman hanged himself in his prison cell. He left no confession, no explanation, taking his secrets to the grave. Harold Shipman's legacy extends far beyond his horrific body count. He represents one of the most extreme examples of betrayed trust in criminal history. A healer who became a killer, using his sacred position to take lives for nearly 20 years. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. A story that will haunt you. A story that shows the terrifying depths of human behavior. This is the case of Luis Garavito, known as La Bestia, the Beast, who became one of the most prolific serial killers in documented history, preying on the most vulnerable victims imaginable. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born in Genova, Colombia, into a family marked by poverty and violence. He was one of 7 children, growing up in an environment where brutality was commonplace. His father was an alcoholic who subjected the family to regular physical abuse, and Luis himself would later claim that he suffered sexual abuse from multiple adults during his childhood, experiences that left deep psychological scars. As a child, Luis was withdrawn and isolated. He had few friends and struggled to form normal relationships with other children. He performed poorly in school and left education at a young age, drifting between odd jobs and never finding stability or purpose. Those who knew him in his youth described him as strange and unsettling, someone who made others uncomfortable without any clear reason why. Luis grew into a man who appeared utterly unremarkable. He was slight in build, soft-spoken, and easily overlooked in a crowd. He worked various menial jobs, never staying anywhere long, never forming lasting connections. He moved frequently throughout Colombia, a country already torn apart by violence from drug cartels and guerrilla warfare. In this chaos, Luis discovered he could move unnoticed, and he learned that certain people, particularly poor and vulnerable children, could disappear without anyone paying much attention. Luis began his killing spree, targeting the most defenseless victims in Colombian society: street children, young boys from impoverished families, children who sold small items on streets or shined shoes to survive. These were children that society had already failed, children who often had no one to miss them or search for them if they vanished. His method was calculated and deceptive. Luis would approach children in town squares, bus stations, or markets, presenting himself as a kind and trustworthy figure. He often posed as a priest, a monk, or a street vendor. He would dress respectably, speak gently, and offer the children small amounts of money, food, or the promise of work. For children living in desperate poverty, these offers were impossible to refuse. Luis would gain their trust, then convince them to walk with him to a supposed job site or to meet someone who could help them. He would lead them away from populated areas, walking for hours into rural countryside, isolated fields, or forests. Once they were completely alone and far from any help, Luis would attack. He would bind the children, torture them, and sexually assault them before killing them. His preferred method of murder was to cut their throats or strangle them. Afterward, he would sometimes mutilate the bodies and often left them exposed in remote locations where they might not be discovered for weeks or months. By the time remains were found, if they were found at all, decomposition and animal activity often made identification difficult or impossible. What made Luis particularly successful at evading capture was the nature of his victims and the chaos of Colombia during this period. The country was experiencing extreme violence from the drug trade and internal conflicts. Thousands of people were disappearing or being killed for various reasons, and law enforcement resources were overwhelmed. Poor street children were low-priority victims in a nation struggling with so many crises. Additionally, Luis never stayed in one place. He moved constantly throughout Colombia and even into neighboring Ecuador and Venezuela. He would commit murders in one region, then disappear and surface hundreds of miles away weeks or months later. This mobility made it extremely difficult for local police forces to recognize patterns or connect crimes across different jurisdictions. For years, Luis killed with shocking frequency. He later confessed to murdering approximately 140 children, though investigators believe the true number could be significantly higher, possibly as many as 300 victims. The sheer scale of his crimes is almost incomprehensible, representing one of the worst cases of serial murder in modern history. What finally led to Luis's capture was a combination of changing circumstances and his own escalating recklessness. As the Colombian government began to achieve more stability and improve law enforcement capabilities, authorities started to pay more attention to the pattern of missing and murdered children. Different police departments began sharing information and noticed similarities in cases across various regions. Luis was eventually apprehended after attempting to assault a boy who managed to escape and alert authorities. When police arrested Luis, he initially denied everything, but under interrogation, he eventually began to confess. What emerged was a horrifying account of years of predatory behavior and murder spanning much of Colombia. Luis led police to many burial sites, helping them recover remains of victims who had never been reported missing or whose disappearances had never been investigated. He provided details of his crimes with disturbing calmness, showing no genuine remorse for the children he had destroyed. Psychological evaluations revealed him to be deeply disturbed, with a complex mixture of personality disorders and a complete lack of empathy for his victims. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by Colombian law. At the time of his crimes and trial, Colombia had abolished the death penalty and had a maximum prison sentence of 30 years, which could be reduced for cooperation with authorities. Despite the magnitude of his crimes, Luis received a sentence of only 30 years, later reduced to 22 years for his cooperation in locating victims' remains. This relatively lenient sentence caused outrage both in Colombia and internationally. Families of victims, what few could be identified, felt betrayed by a justice system that seemed inadequate to address such monstrous crimes. The case prompted discussions about reforming Colombian sentencing laws, though these changes came too late to affect Luis's case. Psychological experts who examined Luis struggled to fully understand his motivations. He showed characteristics of antisocial personality disorder and pedophilia, combined with a history of childhood trauma and abuse. Some theorized that his crimes represented a twisted form of power and control, allowing someone who had been powerless and victimized as a child to dominate and destroy others who reminded him of his younger self. Luis remains imprisoned in Colombia, where he continues to serve his sentence in isolation from other prisoners for his own protection. He has given various interviews over the years, sometimes expressing what appears to be remorse, other times showing the same cold detachment that characterized his crimes. Mental health professionals remain divided on whether he experiences genuine guilt or simply mimics appropriate emotions. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. A story that will haunt you. A story that shows the terrifying depths of human behavior. This is the case of Peter Curtin, known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, a man whose crimes terrorized an entire city and revealed the depths of sadistic cruelty that can hide behind an ordinary face. Peter Curtin was born in Cologne, Germany, into a family consumed by poverty, alcoholism, and violence. He was one of 13 children, raised in a single cramped room where privacy was impossible and depravity was commonplace. His father was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children, and who sexually abused Peter's sisters in front of the other children. This nightmare environment was the foundation of Peter's childhood. The violence Peter witnessed and experienced shaped him in profound ways. He learned early that the world was a place of cruelty, that the strong dominated the weak, and that suffering was simply part of existence. But Peter did not respond to this environment by withdrawing or seeking to escape. Instead, he began to find that violence excited him, that causing pain gave him a sense of power and arousal that nothing else could provide. As a young boy, Peter befriended a local dog catcher who lived in the same building. This man taught Peter how to torture and kill dogs, showing him methods of prolonging their suffering. Peter discovered that he enjoyed this immensely, and he began to torture animals on his own, finding sexual gratification in their pain and death. He would stab dogs, drown cats, and torture any animal he could capture, experiencing intense pleasure from their suffering. Peter's cruelty soon escalated beyond animals. While still a child himself, he discovered he could drown other children and make it appear accidental. On 2 separate occasions, he pushed playmates off a raft into the Rhine River, watching them struggle and drown while pretending to be unable to help. No one suspected these deaths were anything but tragic accidents, and Peter experienced a profound thrill from taking life while maintaining his innocent facade. As Peter entered adolescence, his violent impulses intensified. He began breaking into homes, initially to steal, but increasingly for the thrill of violating private spaces. During one burglary, he discovered a sleeping girl and strangled her, experiencing intense sexual pleasure from the act of killing. He fled before anyone discovered the crime, and once again, he escaped suspicion. Peter's early adult years were marked by petty crime, theft, and fraud. He served multiple prison sentences, and during his incarcerations, he deliberately misbehaved to spend time in solitary confinement. He later explained that in the isolation of his cell, he could spend days fantasizing about violence and murder, creating elaborate scenarios in his mind that gave him intense satisfaction. These fantasies became more detailed and more sadistic with each period of isolation. After his release from a lengthy prison sentence, Peter moved to Dusseldorf and attempted to live a conventional life. He married a woman and worked as a factory worker, maintaining an appearance of respectability. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite man who dressed well and spoke softly. He was active in union activities and presented himself as a respectable member of the working class. No one suspected the darkness that lived within him. But Peter's violent urges had not disappeared. They had been building during his years in prison, growing stronger and more demanding. He began to act on his impulses with increasing frequency and brutality. Peter's crimes in Dusseldorf began with attacks that seemed random and motiveless. He would approach people on dark streets, stab them suddenly, and disappear into the night. Some victims survived, others did not. He attacked men, women, and children with equal randomness. The attacks seemed to have no pattern, no clear motive, and no connection between victims. What made Peter particularly terrifying was the pleasure he derived from every aspect of his crimes. He enjoyed the stalking, the selection of victims, the anticipation of violence. He experienced intense sexual arousal during the attacks themselves, often achieving orgasm while stabbing or strangling his victims. And afterward, he would return to the crime scenes to relive the experience, sometimes drinking blood from the wounds of his victims, which earned him his horrifying nickname. Peter's attacks escalated in frequency and brutality. He murdered a young girl, stabbing her repeatedly and leaving her body in a field. He attacked a woman with a hammer, beating her savagely. He strangled children and threw their bodies into rivers. He attacked couples walking together, stabbing both with frenzied violence. The city of Dusseldorf descended into terror as the attacks continued, with no clear pattern and no apparent way to predict where or when he would strike next. The police investigation was massive, but initially ineffective. Peter's victims were random, his methods varied, and he left little physical evidence. Hundreds of suspects were questioned and released. The public became increasingly frightened, with people afraid to go out after dark. Some businesses closed early, and the streets emptied at night as fear gripped the city. What the police did not realize was that Peter was following the investigation closely, reading newspaper accounts with intense pleasure. He enjoyed the fear he had created, the sense of power it gave him over an entire city. He sometimes attended funerals of his victims or visited memorials, deriving satisfaction from witnessing the grief he had caused. Peter's downfall came through a combination of chance and his own compulsion to talk about his crimes. He had attacked a woman who managed to escape, and she later encountered Peter again by chance. She recognized him, and though he convinced her not to report him initially, she eventually wrote a letter to authorities describing the encounter. The letter was accidentally delivered to the wrong address, opened by a curious resident who recognized its importance and forwarded it to police. When police arrested Peter, he confessed immediately and extensively. He seemed to take pleasure in describing his crimes in elaborate detail, explaining his methods, his victims, and the sensations he experienced. He confessed to dozens of murders and attempted murders, leading police to victims they had not connected to the same killer. Psychological experts who examined Peter found him to be fully aware of right and wrong, capable of controlling his behavior, but utterly indifferent to the suffering of others. He killed because it gave him pleasure, and he felt no more remorse for murdering humans than someone might feel for swatting a fly. He described his crimes with clinical detachment, sometimes becoming animated only when describing particularly brutal details that clearly excited him. Peter's trial attracted international attention. He was ultimately convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. He went to his execution calmly, reportedly asking whether he would be able to hear his own blood gurgling after the blade of the guillotine severed his head, curious to experience even his own death as a source of sensation. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. A story that will haunt you. A story that shows the terrifying depths of human behavior. Charles Cullen, a seemingly gentle nurse, moved quietly between hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, his presence unnoticed except by those who witnessed the quiet, inexplicable deaths that seemed to follow wherever he went. His crimes stretch across 16 years and multiple medical institutions, an unfolding nightmare in the spaces where people expected healing and care, not harm. Nurses are trusted, guardians in the lonely hours of the night, caregivers at the threshold of suffering. Charles Cullen used that trust to mask a hidden agenda. Patients under his care started to die in unusual ways, cardiac arrests and sudden deteriorations common in wards. But the frequency and oddity of these deaths drew only brief suspicion at first. Some were elderly, sick, already close to the end of life. Others, recovering, stable, died with a suddenness that baffled staff and devastated families. Few imagined these moments were not fate, but design. Charles's method was silent and almost invisible. On his shifts, he would select a patient, a process that seemed at times random and at other times disturbingly intentional. He employed his knowledge of hospital drugs, using medications like digoxin, insulin, and others untraceably lethal in the right doses. These substances, administered in the stillness of nighttime rounds or the ordinary bustle of day shifts, would tip the most vulnerable patients into fatal cardiac arrhythmias, respiratory distress, and then nothingness. He was meticulous. Vials were sometimes replaced, records occasionally altered, but most often it was the very nature of hospital life that hid the evidence. Death in these settings can be ascribed to the ravages of disease, the failures of biology rather than intent. In the post-mortem debates among medical teams, Charles was present as a quiet, reliable staff member, rarely a suspect. For many years, the only pattern was tragedy. Still, whispers spread through the halls, an abnormally high mortality rate, notes of missing medications, a feeling of unease around the calmness of Cullen's demeanor. Nurses here and there spoke of concerns, flagged irregularities, but the lack of hard evidence and the fear of implicating a colleague made these warnings easy to overlook or quietly downplay. Hospital administrators, perhaps more concerned with liabilities than justice, often accepted Cullen's resignation when suspicion encroached, allowing him to move on before resolute questions could be asked. For years, Charles Cullen moved from hospital to hospital, sometimes dismissed for odd behavior, sometimes quietly compelled to resign. His resume was patchworked with frequent changes, yet each new facility offered fresh trust. Where he went, unexplained patient deaths would soon follow. The first real breakthrough began with someone who refused to simply accept despair. Amy Luffren, a fellow nurse at Somerset Medical Center, began to notice the disturbing patterns that no one else seemed to be seeing. A series of suspicious codes, unexpected fatalities among patients whose cases should not have ended in death, vials of medication missing or unaccounted for. Amy started to piece it together, documenting her observations and risking her own safety to go to the hospital administration. Faced with mounting anomalies, Somerset Medical launched an internal investigation. Early doubts were met with hesitation, as administrators were wary to accuse and quick to attribute the spike in deaths to bad luck or innocent error. But the pattern soon became undeniable. Drug records and hospital logs began to clearly indicate administering of lethal doses aligning with Cullen's scheduled shifts. Medical examiners found elevated levels of digoxin and insulin in the bloodstreams of several victims, substances not prescribed to many of the deceased patients. In the fall of 2003, detectives and prosecutors were brought in. The investigation methodically reconstructed every shift and every death, correlating hospital records and drug logs to form a chilling picture of calculated, repeated murder. Forensic breakthroughs included digital audit trails on medicine dispensing systems, making it possible to track what vials were accessed, in what quantities, and by whom. It was a meticulous process, piecing together years of hospital data, matching drug records to code blue events, and painstakingly interviewing staff. Cullen was approached by detectives. The interviews revealed a man at the end of endurance, pale and exhausted. Under questioning, his calm facade fell apart. He confessed, at first in halting fragments, then in a torrent of guilt and regret. Charles admitted to dozens of murders, voicing a twisted logic for his actions, claiming he was ending suffering, that he was an angel of mercy, but each justification rang hollow against the reality. Families left in ruin, lives ended not by chance but intent. In the courtroom, the case drew nationwide attention. An ordinary man in scrubs and glasses who'd done the unthinkable under the cover of care. The trial was painstaking, the evidence vast. Witnesses spoke of trust betrayed, their voice trembling as they recounted the last moments with loved ones now known to be victims. Medical experts explained the exacting science behind the crimes, detailing how the drugs used were masked by standard practice, how the patterns only became obvious over years. Defenders attempted to present mitigating circumstances, mental illness, years of trauma, but the enormity of his actions swept aside such explanations. In the end, Charles Cullen was sentenced to multiple life terms, with no possibility of parole. He would never again walk a hospital ward, never again have the trust of the vulnerable in his hands. The aftermath left a lingering tension in the medical world. Institutions re-examined hiring protocols, scrutinized record-keeping, and the movement of staff flagged for cause. The Cullen case prompted sweeping reforms, stricter oversight of medication use, more rigorous systems for tracking drug administration, mandatory reporting of suspicious patterns, and new wariness whenever patterns of unexplained death emerged in medical settings. To this day, the name Charles Cullen conjures unease. Hospitals that once saw themselves as sanctuaries became more vigilant. The case haunted policy discussions, reinforced the crucial role of whistleblowers like Amy Luffrin, and left the medical profession reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that evil can sometimes wear the gentlest of faces. For those who lost loved ones, the case offered little closure. Only the awareness of just how fragile trust can be in places designed for hope. For society, Cullen's story remains a reason to demand vigilance and transparency, to remember the lesson that sometimes darkness moves in the most unsuspected places, and that justice, though delayed, must nevertheless prevail. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. A story that will haunt you. A story that shows the terrifying depths of human behavior. This story begins in 1924 in Chicago, Illinois, with two extraordinarily intelligent and wealthy young men named Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. Both were students at the University of Chicago, and both came from affluent families. Their friendship was founded on a shared fascination with Nietzsche's philosophy, especially the idea of or Superman, which suggested that some people are above moral laws that govern ordinary men. This dangerous belief gave them the audacity to plan what they called the perfect crime, a crime so flawless they believed it would leave no trace and none of the usual consequences. For 7 months, Leopold and Loeb meticulously planned their crime, carefully thinking through every detail from how they would kidnap their victim to how they would dispose of the body. They wanted to demonstrate not just their brilliance, but also their perceived superiority over the legal system and society itself. Their intellect and privilege led them into a chilling experiment with morality and human life. Their victim was Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy who was Richard Loeb's distant cousin and lived nearby. Bobby was a familiar face, and they chose him primarily because he was easy to approach and had a wealthy family. Perfect for a ransom plan despite the fact that their real motive was far darker than money. On May 21st, 1924, Leopold rented a car under the alias Morton D. Ballard. The two men cruised Chicago's streets on the afternoon that Bobby was walking home from school. Loeb persuaded Bobby to enter the car by feigning interest in his tennis racket, an innocent pretense designed to lower the boy's guard. Once inside, Loeb struck Bobby several times on the head with the handle of a chisel to quickly overpower him. They gagged Bobby to silence his cries, creating a frightening scene of control and violence. Bobby's life was taken somewhere in the car during the short ride. After incapacitating Bobby, they drove to a secluded area near Wolf Lake on Chicago's south side. In the darkness, they stripped the boy's clothes and poured hydrochloric acid over his face and genitals, a brutal attempt to make identification difficult and erase a piece of his identity. The body was hidden inside a concrete drainage culvert near the railroad tracks. This act revealed their coldness and their indifference to the child's suffering. Returning to Chicago, Leopold called Bobby's mother, posing as a man named George Johnson. Using a calm voice, he told her son had been kidnapped and that instructions for delivering the ransom would follow. A typed ransom note arrived with precise, complicated instructions for paying $10,000 to secure Bobby's release. Despite all these methods to confuse and delay authorities, the family never received their son alive. Later that night, the two men burned Bobby's clothes in a basement fire and cleaned the bloodstains from the car, as if erasing all traces of an unthinkable crime. Afterwards, they played cards and went about their ordinary lives, behaving as if nothing had happened. The plan quickly unraveled. The ransom payment was never made because Bobby's body was discovered within a day, found partially exposed through the weeds by a laborer. The acid they had poured on him had not hidden his identity completely. Investigators became suspicious when eyeglasses were found near the body. Although spectacles were common, the unique design of the hinges on the frame, custom-made by one of only 3 opticians in Chicago, was rare. Nathan Leopold, a known customer, was identified as the owner. His story that the glasses dropped during a bird-watching trip was weak and unconvincing. The police further investigated the alibis Leopold and Loeb gave for the time of the crime. They claimed that they had picked up 2 women earlier that afternoon and dropped them off later. But witnesses contradicted this, and Leopold's chauffeur confirmed the car was actually in the garage for repairs. A crucial piece of evidence was the discovery of the typewriter used to compose the ransom note, found dumped in nearby Jackson Park Lagoon. Under pressure, Loeb confessed first, claiming Leopold had planned a crime and was driving the car while Loeb killed Bobby with the chisel. Leopold quickly followed with his confession, stating the opposite, that he was driving while Loeb struck the fatal blows. Their confessions, though differing slightly in details, matched on most other points and confirmed their involvement beyond doubt. They admitted their true motives were not money, but to experiment with the idea of committing a perfect crime. They saw themselves as intellectual titans, detached from ordinary emotions, interested in learning what it felt like to kill a human being. Leopold coldly likened their action to an entomologist pinning insects to a board for study, a scientific experiment without compassion or remorse. When their families hired the famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow, he faced an enormous challenge. His clients had pleaded guilty, so the only question was whether they would receive the death penalty or life imprisonment. Darrow's strategy was to argue against capital punishment itself, delivering a powerful plea to the judge. His speeches lasted nearly 8 hours, warning against barbaric retribution and emphasizing the possibility of reform and redemption even for those who commit terrible crimes. His arguments swayed not only the courtroom, but sparked a nationwide debate on justice and morality. In the end, the judge sentenced Leopold and Loeb to life imprisonment plus 99 years for kidnapping. The death penalty was avoided, marking a victory for Darrow and for arguments against state execution. The lives of both men diverged after their sentencing. Loeb was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1936, his life ending in a brutal prison killing. Leopold, however, reformed himself behind bars, showing good behavior and seeking education. After serving over 3 decades, he was paroled in 1958. He spent the rest of his life quietly teaching and lived until 1971, remorseful and withdrawn from public life. This case, labeled the crime of the century, captivated the American public with its combination of wealth, intellect, and cold-blooded murder. It highlighted the dark side of brilliance and how dangerous it can be when moral constraints are discarded. Leopold and Loeb became cautionary figures, showcasing the fragile boundary between genius and madness, and how the arrogance of privilege can blind individuals to the value of human life. Their story continues to resonate in popular culture, inspiring plays, films, and literature that examine the complexities of morality, justice, and human psychology. It remains a grim reminder that intelligence, power, or social status do not grant immunity from humanity's deepest sins, and that the thirst for knowledge or control can lead to devastating acts when untethered from conscience. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a man whose crimes were both meticulous and horrifying. A man who exploited vulnerability and trust in ways that are almost unimaginable. His name was Hiroshi Mio. To the outside world, he was unremarkable, blending into society without raising suspicion. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked a mind consumed by obsession, control, and a fascination with life and death. This is the story of how he preyed on the vulnerable, lured them with promises of assistance, and committed murders that would shock Japan and the world. Hiroshi Mio was born in 1970 in Japan. His early childhood was quiet on the surface, But beneath the domestic calm, he experienced neglect and emotional distance. His parents were strict and demanding, rarely showing warmth or encouragement. From a young age, Hiroshi exhibited behaviors that were deeply troubling. He was quiet and introverted, yet he also displayed a fascination with death and suffering. He would often watch injuries or accidents with an unusual intensity, and he began developing a mindset that viewed control over others as a form of power. During his teenage years, Hiroshi had difficulty forming stable social relationships. He was intelligent but socially awkward, and he often preferred solitude. Teachers noted his tendency to observe rather than interact, but they also reported sudden irritability and moments of aggression when challenged. He began to show signs of manipulativeness and deceit, behaviors that would later become central to his crimes. By the time he reached early adulthood, he had developed an unusual combination of sexual compulsion and fascination with mortality, a combination that made his actions particularly dangerous. Hiroshi's crimes were methodical and chilling. He identified a specific subset of people to target, men who were vulnerable and actively seeking assistance to end their lives. He found these individuals through online forums and suicide-related bulletin boards, places where people expressed despair and sought guidance. He would communicate with them carefully, establishing trust and portraying himself as a helper, someone who could guide them through the process safely. This method of approach required patience, manipulation, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Once Hiroshi gained the trust of his victims, he would arrange meetings, often under the guise of providing companionship or guidance. He would select locations that offered privacy and control, such as his apartment, secluded parks, or abandoned buildings. The moment he had the victim alone, he would commit the murder, usually through strangulation. This method allowed him complete control and minimized the likelihood of resistance. He would stage the scenes carefully, removing evidence that could point back to him, and in some cases, dispose of the bodies in locations where they might not be discovered immediately. The pattern of his crimes reveals both the precision and the cruelty of his actions. Each victim had a unique story, yet each was drawn into Hiroshi's orbit through manipulation, trust, and the promise of assistance. Many were young men struggling with depression, isolation, or personal despair. Hiroshi exploited their vulnerabilities, presenting himself as a guide or confidant, while secretly preparing to take their lives. He studied their routines, learned their fears, and anticipated their behavior, which allowed him to execute his crimes without immediate detection. The social context of early 2000s Japan played a role in how Hiroshi operated. Suicide was a sensitive topic, often stigmatized, and those seeking help were cautious about whom to trust. This allowed Hiroshi to hide in plain sight, preying on individuals who were unlikely to report him or whose absence might not immediately draw attention. His ability to navigate these social dynamics with apparent normalcy made him particularly dangerous. Authorities began noticing patterns when several men were found dead under similar circumstances: strangulation, evidence of manipulation, and careful staging. Police investigations were complicated because the victims had willingly met with Hiroshi, leaving few physical clues. Detectives painstakingly traced online communications, witness statements, and behavioral patterns, slowly piecing together the connections between the murders. Hiroshi Mu's eventual capture involved meticulous police work. Investigators identified him through internet activity, analysis of postings on suicide forums, and reports from individuals who had observed suspicious behavior. When confronted, he initially denied involvement, but the weight of evidence, including his digital footprint and physical evidence, led to full confessions. He described how he selected his victims, how he communicated with them online, and the methods he used to carry out the murders. Psychologists later studied him, identifying traits of psychopathy, sexual sadism, and obsessive control over life and death. The trial of Hiroshi Mu drew intense public attention. Courtrooms were filled with families of victims, journalists, and concerned citizens. Witnesses recounted his manipulations, his online interactions, and the terror he caused in his victims' final moments. Forensic experts detailed the crime scenes, linking patterns, methods, and evidence directly to him. Psychologists testified about his personality, compulsions, and lack of empathy, explaining how someone could commit repeated murders while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy. Hiroshi was ultimately convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The case left a lasting impact on Japanese society, highlighting the dangers of online predation, the vulnerabilities of those struggling with mental health issues, and the challenges law enforcement faces in the digital age. Families of victims struggled with grief and shock, compounded by the betrayal inherent in Hiroshi's manipulation. He presented himself as a helper, only to betray their trust in the most horrifying way. Even decades later, Hiroshi Mu's case remains a critical study in criminology, psychology, and sociology. His crimes illustrate the ways in which predators exploit trust, the intersection of technology and human vulnerability, and the extreme consequences of unchecked compulsion. His story is a chilling reminder that appearances can deceive, that danger can hide behind ordinary faces, and that careful study of human behavior is essential to prevent such horrors. The investigation, trial, and subsequent analysis of Hiroshi's crimes have provided law enforcement and psychologists with invaluable insights into digital predation, psychological manipulation, and the behavior of calculated serial killers. His life, crimes, and the public reaction to them continue to be referenced in studies, documentaries, and discussions about safety, mental health, and criminal behavior. Hiroshi Mu's story is a cautionary tale about the dark side of human nature, the dangers of misplaced trust, and the lengths to which a person consumed by compulsion can go to satisfy their urges. The meticulous planning, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and the ability to mask evil behind a facade of normalcy make his case both terrifying and instructive. It is a story that haunts not because of random chaos, but because it demonstrates how a calculated mind can operate in plain sight, manipulating the lives of those most at risk with terrifying precision. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of a man whose charm masked a terrifying darkness. A man who turned the streets of Bucharest into a place of fear, whose presence alone could chill the hearts of young women walking alone at night. His name was Vladimir Ionsian, known infamously as the Strangler of Bucharest. This is the story of his life, his psychology, the terror he caused, the victims he hunted, the investigation that finally captured him, the trial, and the lasting impact of his crimes. Vladimir Ionsian was born in 1932 in Romania. His early life was marked by hardship, instability, and family tensions. He grew up in a society struggling with economic difficulties, and his family faced frequent financial and social pressures. From a young age, Vladimir displayed traits that would later define his criminal behavior: charm, manipulativeness, a need for attention, and a disturbing fascination with control over others. Teachers and neighbors noted that he could be sociable and intelligent, yet he was also prone to impulsive aggression and a lack of empathy toward others, especially those weaker or more vulnerable. During adolescence, Vladimir began experimenting with theft, minor aggression, and deception. He was able to use his charm to manipulate peers and adults, often avoiding serious consequences for his misdeeds. This combination of intelligence, charm, and a lack of moral constraint laid the foundation for the predator he would become. As he matured into adulthood, he began to channel his impulses toward more dangerous and violent tendencies, particularly an obsession with young women and a compulsion to dominate and control. By the mid-1950s, Vladimir lived in Bucharest, working odd jobs and moving through society with apparent normalcy. To the casual observer, he was a friendly, polite, and helpful young man. But beneath this exterior, he had developed a methodical approach to predation. He would select young women who were alone, often in parks, streets, or public transport, using his charm to approach them. He would gain their trust with conversation, persuasion, and attention, presenting himself as a friendly acquaintance or helper. Once he had the woman isolated, he would carry out his murders, often by strangulation, a method that allowed him control, precision, and, at times, a sense of satisfaction from the act itself. The fear Vladimir instilled in Bucharest grew gradually as women began disappearing. His victims shared a common pattern: young, often alone, approached by a man who seemed harmless. Families reported missing daughters and sisters, and the community slowly became aware of a predator moving undetected among them. Unlike random killers, Vladimir carefully planned his attacks. He studied his victims, learned their routines, and waited for the right moment to strike. Each encounter demonstrated a calculated blend of charm, manipulation, and lethal violence. Police investigations were initially slow, as the pattern of disappearances was not immediately connected. The chaotic post-war urban environment, combined with social disruptions, gave Vladimir an opportunity to operate without immediate suspicion. Detectives began piecing together information from witness statements, discovery sites, and survivor accounts. They noticed a pattern. Women had been approached by a man matching a particular description, often in public spaces where he could appear unthreatening. Surveillance, questioning, and careful analysis of behaviors gradually focused attention on Vladimir as a suspect. His arrest came after careful observation and reports from women who had narrowly escaped him. Witnesses described his mannerisms, voice, and behavior, which led authorities to track him down. When confronted, Vladimir initially denied the killings, maintaining a calm and polite demeanor. But evidence, including testimonies, physical proof, and forensic data, forced him to confess. During interrogation, he explained how he selected victims, gained their trust, and committed the murders, revealing the cold calculation behind his predation. Psychologists later evaluated him, noting traits of psychopathy, obsessive control, and a disturbing sexual compulsion. The trial of Vladimir Ionsian captured national attention. Courtrooms were filled with journalists, family members of victims, and ordinary citizens shocked by the revelations. Witnesses recounted his manipulations, the terrifying circumstances of his attacks, and the fear he had instilled throughout the city. Forensic experts detailed the crime scenes, methods of killing, and the patterns that linked him to each victim. Psychologists explained his personality and mental state, describing the dangerous combination of charm, intelligence, and lack of empathy that allowed him to commit multiple murders without detection for a period of time. Vladimir was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The case had a profound impact on Bucharest. Families of victims struggled with grief and the horror of knowing their loved ones had been lured and killed by a man who seemed ordinary to others. The city grappled with fear and distrust, particularly among women who were alone in public spaces. His crimes became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers lurking behind charm and appearances. Even decades later, Vladimir Ionsian's story continues to be studied in criminology, psychology, and criminal justice. His methods, manipulation, and ability to exploit trust provide insight into the behavior of predatory individuals. His case serves as a chilling reminder that danger often comes from those who appear normal, and that careful observation, community awareness, and psychological insight are crucial in identifying and stopping predators. The investigation, trial, and subsequent study of Vladimir's crimes have provided invaluable lessons about serial predation, the psychology of charm combined with violence, and the social conditions that can enable such behavior. His life, crimes, and conviction are a lasting testament to the terror one individual can instill in a community and the importance of vigilance in recognizing the warning signs of predatory behavior. Vladimir Ionsian's story is not just one of murder, but of manipulation, deception, and the exploitation of trust. It is a story that haunts because it demonstrates how easily danger can hide behind an ordinary face, how calculated violence can operate in plain sight, and how fear can permeate a city long after the predator is gone. It remains a chilling example of human darkness, the complexity of criminal psychology, and the lasting impact of serial violence on families, communities, and society as a whole. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Vladimir Ionsian, whose presence on the streets of Bucharest in the late 1950s instilled fear in women across the city. He was a man who could appear charming and polite, yet beneath that exterior was a mind consumed by compulsion, control, and a dangerous fascination with young women. His crimes were methodical, predatory, and terrifying, and the story begins with his first known victim. The first young woman Vladimir targeted was a 19-year-old named Elena. She lived with her family in Bucharest and often spent evenings walking alone after work or school. Elena was cautious but sociable, someone who trusted people easily when they seemed kind and polite. On a warm evening, she encountered Vladimir while walking through a quiet street near a neighborhood. Vladimir had been observing the area, noticing which women walked alone and how they responded to friendly approaches. Vladimir approached Elena with a smile and a gentle tone, offering to accompany her for safety. He presented himself as a helpful acquaintance, someone genuinely concerned about her well-being. Elena, feeling reassured by his polite demeanor, accepted his company. Vladimir's skill at charm and subtle manipulation allowed him to appear trustworthy, making it easier for him to lead her to a quieter area. Once isolated, Vladimir's behavior changed. He subtly exerted control over Elena, guiding her steps and limiting her ability to escape. His method of strangulation was deliberate, designed to maintain control and ensure compliance without alerting passersby. He took his time, ensuring the act was carried out efficiently. After the murder, Vladimir carefully examined the scene, ensuring there was no evidence that could directly connect him to the crime. He then left Elena's body in a location he knew would delay discovery. The discovery of Elena's body shocked the community. Families of young women grew fearful, and rumors began circulating about a possible predator in the area. Police began investigating, but initial leads were scarce. Witnesses described a young man who had been seen walking with Elena before her disappearance, but the details were vague. Forensic methods at the time were limited, making it difficult to immediately connect this murder to others. Vladimir observed the growing fear with quiet satisfaction. He learned from each crime, refining his approach to minimize risk and maximize control. The first murder set a pattern. He would select young women who were alone, appear friendly and helpful, gain their trust, and then commit the murder in a controlled, methodical manner. The second victim followed a similar pattern. She was a 21-year-old student named Mariana, who often walked home late from university lectures. Vladimir had studied the routes women commonly took and identified Mariana as a potential target. He approached her in a calm, non-threatening way, initiating casual conversation and offering to walk her home. Mariana, like Elena, did not perceive immediate danger. Vladimir guided her to a secluded area and carried out the murder with precise control, ensuring no evidence was left to implicate him directly. Each successive victim increased the tension in Bucharest. Women grew fearful of walking alone. Families warned daughters to stay inside after dark, and the police were under pressure to find suspect. Vladimir's ability to blend into normal society allowed him to continue his crimes undetected. He remained polite and sociable in public, avoiding suspicion while meticulously planning his attacks. Investigators began to notice patterns. Witnesses described a young man, medium height, polite, with a calm demeanor, seen with several victims before they were found dead. Forensic teams analyzed the crime scenes, noting similarities in method, location, and victim profile. Slowly, authorities realized they were dealing with a serial predator. Vladimir's third victim was a 20-year-old named Anka. She worked in a small shop and often walked home in the evenings. Vladimir had observed her routine and planned the encounter carefully. He approached her in a familiar manner, initiating conversation and offering assistance. Once she was isolated, he executed the murder with the same controlled method of strangulation, leaving her body in a location chosen to delay discovery. With each crime, Vladimir refined his techniques. He became more confident, more methodical, and increasingly difficult to detect. The city was gripped by fear, women traveled in groups, and police intensified patrols in areas where young women were likely to walk alone. Despite the heightened attention, Vladimir continued his pattern, exploiting the trust of those who underestimated him. The investigation expanded. Police compiled witness statements, conducted stakeouts, and attempted to predict his next move. Psychological profiling suggested a man who appeared normal, but was highly manipulative, obsessed with control, and capable of committing repeated murders without remorse. Each victim provided insights into his behavior, but the challenge remained to apprehend him before more lives were lost. Vladimir's fourth victim, a 22-year-old named Ioana, was similarly targeted. She often took evening walks after finishing her studies. Vladimir approached her on a quiet street, using the same charm and calm demeanor he had perfected. He guided her to a secluded area, restrained her, and committed the murder. The pattern was now unmistakable. Young women alone, approached politely, isolated, and strangled. The accumulation of evidence, witness reports, and forensic similarities eventually allowed police to identify Vladimir as a suspect. Surveillance and careful tracking narrowed the search, and tips from women who had previously encountered him provided crucial information. Finally, he was apprehended. During interrogation, Vladimir initially maintained a calm and polite demeanor, denying involvement. However, confronted with the mounting evidence, he confessed to the murders, providing detailed accounts of each encounter, manipulation, and killing. The trial of Vladimir Ionsian was a national sensation. Courtrooms were packed with families, journalists, and citizens. Witnesses recounted his charm, the manipulative interactions with victims, and the terror he caused. Forensic experts presented detailed evidence of the murders, linking patterns of method, location, and behavior. Psychologists described his personality, obsession with control, and lack of empathy, explaining how he was able to commit multiple murders while appearing ordinary. Vladimir Ionsian was ultimately convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The impact on Bucharest was profound. Families of victims struggled with grief and shock. Communities were left wary, and the story of a charming young man who became a calculated predator became a cautionary tale for decades to come. Even today, the case of Vladimir Ionsian is studied in criminology, psychology, and criminal justice. His methods, manipulation, and ability to exploit trust provide insights into predatory behavior and the psychology of charm combined with violence. His crimes remind society of the hidden dangers behind ordinary appearances and the importance of vigilance in recognizing predatory patterns. Vladimir Ionsian's story is a chilling example of calculated violence, the exploitation of trust, and the terror one individual can impose on a city. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Yang Xinhai, one of the most feared serial killers in modern Chinese history. A man whose presence turned quiet villages into places of terror, whose crimes were deliberate, methodical, and shockingly brutal. He moved silently through rural China, exploiting isolation and the vulnerability of families, committing murders so calculated that even in the chaos, few could trace them back to him. His story is not just about the crimes he committed, but about the darkness of human psychology, the patterns of predation, and the lengths one man could go to satisfy his compulsions. Yang Xinhai was born in 1968 in Hunan Province, a region of China known for its rural landscapes and economic hardship. His early life was shaped by poverty, scarcity, and familial instability. From a young age, he exhibited troubling behavior. Teachers and neighbors noted that he was withdrawn, yet capable of sudden aggression. He lacked normal social empathy, often reacting to minor slights or frustrations with disproportionate anger. Neighbors recalled that he was calm and polite one moment, then aggressive or cruel the next, displaying a kind of unpredictability that hinted at deeper psychological issues. In adolescence, Yang began testing boundaries. He engaged in theft, minor assaults, and manipulative behavior. He was intelligent, capable of deception, and knew how to avoid detection, traits that would later make him a dangerous predator. His fascination with control and dominance grew as he aged. By early adulthood, he had internalized a compulsion for violence, paired with a methodical mind capable of planning attacks and escaping consequences. Yang's first known murders were committed in the early 1990s, but it would take years before authorities fully understood the scope of his crimes. He targeted isolated households in rural villages, often at night. Families were home, unprepared for the violence that would descend upon them. His approach was calculated. He would observe his victims' routines, identify when the house was least offended, and choose moments when resistance would be minimal. Once inside, he would execute the murders with blunt force, stabbing, or strangulation. Each act was deliberate, precise, and cold. The first family Yang attacked lived on the outskirts of a small village. He had studied their home, noticing when most family members were at work or asleep. Entering the house, he subdued the residents one by one. His method was violent but controlled, ensuring that no one could escape to alert neighbors. After completing the murders, he ransacked the home for valuables and left without leaving evidence that could be traced directly to him. The villagers were shocked when the family was found the next day, the brutality leaving an indelible mark on the community. The second incident followed a similar pattern. Yang carefully selected his next victims, again exploiting isolation. This household consisted of a young couple and an elderly parent. He observed them, learning their routines over days, and waited until nightfall. Entering quietly, he overpowered them, carrying out the murders with the same meticulous efficiency. He then cleaned parts of the crime scene and left the area, making it difficult for investigators to immediately connect this incident to the previous one. Over the next several years, Yang's attacks spread across Hunan and neighboring provinces. He became bolder, striking in multiple villages, often leaving behind scenes so brutal that survivors were deeply traumatized. In one particularly harrowing case, he entered a house where a mother, father, and 3 children lived. He overpowered the parents first, then the children, killing them in a sequence that demonstrated careful planning and an utter lack of empathy. Each murder reinforced his compulsion and confidence, allowing him to refine his methods. Authorities struggled to link these crimes. Rural areas lacked advanced forensic technology, and the murders were spread across wide regions. Witnesses were scarce, and fear prevented many from coming forward. Police began mapping patterns. The methods of killing, the types of households targeted, the rural locations, and the timing of the attacks. Slowly, the picture of a single perpetrator began to emerge. Yang Xinhai's ability to blend into society contributed to his continued evasion. He worked various jobs, moving from village to village. He presented himself as polite, helpful, and unremarkable. No one suspected that the quiet laborer walking through the village streets during the day could commit atrocities at night. His duality, ordinary citizen by day, predator by night, made him extremely difficult to apprehend. Each victim had a story. One woman, 28 years old, was preparing dinner for her family when Yang entered the home. He forced compliance, restrained her, and killed her and the other household members. In another case, a young man returning from work was overpowered before he could raise the alarm. Detailed accounts from surviving neighbors, footprints, and patterns of entry eventually helped the authorities understand the methods Yang employed. The investigation intensified in the late 1990s. Police began coordinating across regions, comparing case files, witness statements, and physical evidence. Patterns emerged. The selection of rural households, the use of surprise attacks, the methodical execution of murders, and the timing of attacks often during night hours. Psychological profiling suggested a man with obsessive control, lack of empathy, and compulsive violent tendencies. Yang Xinhai's eventual capture occurred after surveillance, tips from local villagers, and careful forensic analysis. Authorities had begun predicting likely targets, monitoring movements, and questioning laborers passing through villages. When confronted, Yang initially denied involvement, but the overwhelming evidence, fingerprints, connections between crime scenes, witness identification, forced a confession. He detailed each murder, explaining how he chose his victims, entered their homes, and committed the killings. Psychologists later analyzed him, noting psychopathy, emotional detachment, and compulsive violent tendencies. The trial was extensive. Families of victims attended, journalists reported widely, and citizens followed developments closely. Witnesses recounted his deceptive charm, his ability to enter homes unnoticed, and the terror he instilled. Forensic experts presented evidence from multiple scenes, linking Yang to dozens of murders. Psychologists explained his mental state, lack of remorse, and compulsions, helping the court understand how one man could commit repeated atrocities without immediate detection. Yang Xinhai was ultimately convicted of the murder of 67 people and sentenced to death. The impact on China was profound. Communities across Hunan and neighboring provinces were left traumatized. Families struggled with grief, and the psychological scar of his crimes lasted for decades. His actions prompted changes in rural policing, forensic methods, and awareness about domestic vulnerability. Even today, Yang Xinhai's story is studied in criminology, psychology, and law enforcement. His meticulous planning, predatory behavior, and exploitation of isolation provide lessons on serial predation. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of one of the darkest and most haunting criminal cases in Canadian history. The story of Robert Pickton, a man whose crimes preyed on the most vulnerable women in Vancouver, leaving a trail of fear, grief, and unanswered questions. This is the story of his life, the forces that shaped him, the choices he made, and the chilling consequences of those choices. Robert Pickton was born in 1949 in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, a small town where his family owned and operated a pig farm. From a young age, Pickton's life was marked by isolation and hardship. He grew up with siblings in a household that could be harsh and unforgiving. His father was distant and sometimes aggressive, and his mother, while caring, struggled to manage the demands of raising several children on a remote and difficult farm. Neighbors and teachers recalled that Robert was quiet and withdrawn as a child, but capable of sudden outbursts of aggression. He was an intelligent boy, but also one who seemed detached from the normal emotional bonds that connected others to family and community. As he grew older, Pickton's behavior became increasingly concerning. He developed an obsession with sexual imagery and control, often exploring boundaries in ways that were inappropriate and disturbing. He had trouble maintaining normal social relationships, and his interactions were frequently manipulative or coercive. By the time he reached adulthood, these tendencies had crystallized into a pattern of predatory thinking. He was highly aware of power dynamics, especially in situations where he could exploit vulnerability. In adulthood, Pickton returned to the family farm, which would later become the scene of his crimes. The farm was isolated, providing both a refuge and a tool for his increasingly dark impulses. At the same time, he began spending time in Vancouver, particularly in the downtown east side, a neighborhood where poverty, addiction, and social marginalization made women especially vulnerable. Pickton quickly identified women who were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction as potential targets. These women were less likely to be reported missing immediately, and their disappearances often received minimal attention, allowing Pickton to operate with alarming impunity. Pickton's methods were both predatory and calculated. He would approach women with charm, offering help, companionship, or promises of work. He was patient, studying routines and patterns, learning when individuals would be most isolated and most likely to comply with his suggestions. Once a woman was isolated, he would commit the murder, often using blunt force or strangulation. The farm provided him with privacy, and he developed systems for storing and disposing of evidence. He repeated this process over several years, becoming increasingly confident and efficient in his methods. The first victim in this series of crimes was a young woman who frequently worked in the downtown east side. She was in her early 20s, struggling with addiction, and known to spend nights on the streets. Pickton approached her one evening, offering help and a place to stay for the night. She accepted, trusting his apparent kindness. Once at the farm, Pickton overpowered her. He carried out the murder with methodical control, ensuring she could not escape or call for help. Afterward, he left the crime scene, taking steps to conceal evidence and minimize any trace that could link him to the crime. The second victim followed a similar pattern. She was slightly older, also involved in sex work and had a network of friends and colleagues who cared for her. Picton observed her, learned her routines, and approached her in a way that seemed harmless. He invited her to the farm under the pretense of shelter or work. Once there, he restrained and killed her, again leaving no immediate evidence. This repetition, over multiple victims, began to form a pattern, although authorities at the time were slow to recognize it. Over the next several years, Picton's crimes escalated in frequency and brutality. Women in the downtown East Side began disappearing at alarming rates, but systemic neglect and societal biases meant that these disappearances were often not treated with urgency. Families of missing women struggled to be heard, sometimes facing skepticism or dismissal from authorities. Picton exploited these gaps in the system, continuing to lure and murder women while evading capture. Each murder was preceded by careful observation. Picton studied his victims' behaviors, schedules, and vulnerabilities. He approached them in ways that appeared ordinary, friendly, or helpful, gaining trust before committing the act. His control extended beyond the moment of attack. He took steps to ensure the victims could not leave evidence or survive to identify him. In doing so, he displayed traits of extreme manipulative skill and emotional detachment. Investigators began to piece together the scale of the crimes in the late 1990s. They noticed patterns in the disappearances, including victim profiles, geographic locations, and timing. The breakthrough came through a combination of witness reports, forensic evidence, and the persistence of police officers who refused to ignore the growing number of missing women. Surveillance, interviews, and stakeouts eventually led them to suspect the farm as a central location in the pattern of disappearances. The arrest of Robert Picton in 2002 revealed the shocking extent of his crimes. Police discovered remains, personal effects of victims, and extensive evidence of planning and concealment. The scale of the murders was staggering, and the public was confronted with a level of depravity that had gone unchecked for years. Forensic teams meticulously documented the scene, linking multiple murders and establishing a clear pattern of predation. The trial of Picton was long, emotionally charged, and nationally followed. Families of victims gave testimony about the women they had lost and the trauma the disappearances had caused. Forensic experts presented detailed evidence, connecting Picton to numerous murders and showing how he had concealed evidence over years. Psychologists provided insight into his mind, describing his lack of empathy, compulsive sexual predation, and meticulous planning. The courtroom became a place where the magnitude of his crimes and the systemic failures that allowed them were fully exposed. Robert Picton was ultimately convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. The impact on the Vancouver community was profound. Survivors, families, and the public grappled with grief, fear, and anger. The case prompted deep reflection on law enforcement priorities, social neglect, and the vulnerability of marginalized populations. Programs were introduced to better protect women at risk, and systemic reforms were implemented to prevent similar oversights in the future. Even today, Picton's crimes are studied in criminology, psychology, and law enforcement. His story demonstrates how vulnerability, societal neglect, and manipulative predation can combine to allow repeated acts of extreme violence. It also highlights the importance of vigilance, community awareness, and protection of the most at-risk individuals. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the greatest deceptions in modern crime history. It is the story of a man who fooled judges, journalists, artists, and even entire nations into believing that he had transformed from a violent killer into a redeemed poet. He was invited into schools to lecture children about morality. He was interviewed on television as a model of rehabilitation, and he mingled with intellectuals who admired his talent. But behind this carefully constructed mask, he was still killing, still stalking, still strangling women with cold precision. His name was Jack Unterweger, and his life remains one of the most haunting lessons about trust, manipulation, and evil hidden in plain sight. Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in the small Austrian town of Judenburg. His childhood was marked from the very beginning by instability and neglect. His mother was a young barmaid, often described as irresponsible and unstable, who had a fleeting relationship with an American soldier stationed in post-war Europe. That soldier disappeared before Jack was even born, leaving the boy fatherless. His mother's lifestyle made her incapable of providing stability, and Jack spent much of his youth moving between relatives, foster homes, and the streets. The boy grew up in poverty and isolation. He was teased for his background, seen as an outcast, and from a very young age he developed a sense of resentment toward society. By the time he was in his early teens, he had already begun committing petty crimes, theft, and assault. He showed little regard for rules or authority. More disturbingly, he displayed cruelty toward others, particularly women. Teachers and relatives noticed his lies, his charm, and his strange ability to manipulate those around him. These traits would only grow stronger as he matured. As a young man, Unterweger drifted through life without steady work. He lived as a small-time criminal, committing robberies and burglaries, spending time in and out of jail. But by the mid-1970s, his violence escalated. In 1974, he committed his first known murder. His victim was an 18-year-old German woman named Margaret Schaefer. He picked her up, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death using her own bra. The act was brutal and deeply symbolic. The very object of femininity was turned into an instrument of death. The method revealed the psychological signature that would define his killings for decades. He was arrested soon after and sentenced to life in prison. Most people would have expected him to fade into obscurity behind bars. But Jack Unterweger was not ordinary. In prison, he began to reinvent himself. He discovered writing. He started with poetry, short stories, and eventually wrote an autobiography. His work was raw, confessional, and dark, filled with reflections on crime, suffering, and the human condition. To some, it sounded authentic. Intellectuals, journalists, and artists began to take notice of him. By the 1980s, Unterweger was a minor celebrity in Austrian literary circles. He was praised as a man who had turned his life around through art. Supporters argued that he was living proof that rehabilitation was possible. Public figures, including well-known writers and even politicians, campaigned for his release. They described him as a sensitive man who had confronted his demons. The prison system was pressured, and eventually, after serving only 15 years of his life sentence, Jack Unterweger was released in 1990. His freedom was greeted almost like the debut of a cultural star. He appeared on television talk shows, gave radio interviews, and was invited to schools to speak about the dangers of crime. Newspapers published his articles, and he was even asked to cover stories about crime and prostitution. He presented himself as a moral commentator, a man who had once sinned but now stood as a warning for others. Austria embraced him, but within months of his release, sex workers began to disappear. Their bodies were found strangled with their own bras, just like the murder in 1974. The pattern was chillingly familiar. Over the next 2 years, a wave of killings spread across Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. Unterweger traveled frequently under the pretense of research and writing. In reality, he was hunting. In a grotesque twist, he even traveled to Los Angeles as a visiting journalist in 1991. There, while supposedly researching a story about prostitution, 3 women were murdered in exactly the same manner. The bra ligature was unmistakable. He wrote articles condemning the conditions of sex workers, even as he killed them. It was a double life so audacious that it shocked investigators when the truth came out. By 1992, suspicions became impossible to ignore. Austrian police matched his movements with the locations of the murders. Fibers from his clothing were linked to victims. Witnesses placed him near crime scenes. The facade began to crumble. But when authorities moved to arrest him, Unterweger fled with a girlfriend, crossing borders and evading capture. For months he was on the run, until finally, in February 1992, he was arrested in Miami, Florida. His trial in Austria in 1994 was one of the most publicized in the country's history. The courtroom was packed, cameras rolled, and the once celebrated writer now stood exposed as a predator. The evidence was overwhelming. He was charged with 11 murders across Austria, Germany, and the United States. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life without parole. But Jack Unterweger was not willing to live out another prison term. On June 29, 1994, the very night he was sentenced, he tied the drawstring of his prison tracksuit around his neck and hanged himself in his cell. It was a final act of control, one last deception, denying the world the spectacle of watching him age behind bars. The method of his suicide echoed his crimes, once again using a ligature to end life. The story of Jack Unterweger remains one of the most disturbing cautionary tales in modern history. It revealed how charisma and talent can blind even the most educated people, how the hunger for redemption stories can lead society to ignore warning signs, and how evil can thrive beneath the mask of art and intellect. His victims, many of them women on the margins of society, were overshadowed during his lifetime by the fascination with the killer himself. Today, their names are remembered as the true tragedy at the heart of his story. Jack Unterweger's life is a lesson in deception. He was not reformed. He was not healed. He was a manipulator, a predator, and a killer who used culture itself as a shield. His story reminds us that words can charm, but actions never lie. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a woman whose fear of death became a force of horror. Every parent fears losing their children, but Leonarda Cianciulli's fear consumed her to the point of madness. She believed that death was always watching, always waiting to take her family, and she would stop at nothing to protect them. Her solution was unthinkable. She murdered innocent women, dismembered them, and turned their bodies into soap and cakes, which she then used or distributed, believing these acts would shield her children from fate. This is the story of Leonarda Cianciulli, the soap maker of Correggio, a woman whose obsession transformed ordinary life into a nightmare for everyone she touched. Leonarda was born in 1894 in Montella, a small town in southern Italy, one of 13 children, though only a few survived infancy. Her early life was dominated by grief and death. Her mother died when Leonarda was still a child, and her father was distant, strict, and often harsh. She grew up in a household where superstition was part of daily life and where the threat of misfortune seemed ever present. She witnessed death as a constant companion, and this awareness shaped the way she viewed the world. Survival, safety, and the avoidance of death became central to her thinking. As she grew older, Leonarda became increasingly superstitious and obsessed with the occult. She studied tarot cards, astrology, fortune-telling, and mystical rituals. She believed she could interpret fate, foresee misfortune, and influence events through ritual. These beliefs gave her a sense of control over a world she perceived as chaotic and dangerous. Her obsession with death deepened when she married Michel Cianciulli in 1917 and had children. Though she hoped family life would bring stability, tragedy continued to follow her. One of her children died, and the fear of losing the remaining children became all-consuming. By the 1930s, Leonarda's fear of death had become a compulsion with fatal consequences. She was convinced that in order to protect her family, she needed to perform rituals involving human sacrifice. She believed that by killing women and using their bodies in specific ways, she could transfer their life force to herself and her family, shielding them from harm. Her first known victim was Faustina Setti, a woman who had come to Leonarda's home seeking spiritual guidance. Leonarda invited her in, drugged her, and murdered her. She then dismembered the body, boiling some parts in a soap and baking others into cakes. She believed consuming or distributing these products would protect her children. Over the next several years, Leonarda continued her ritual murders, carefully selecting vulnerable women who would trust her. She lured them with promises of fortune-telling, employment, or friendship. Once inside her home, she killed them, dismembered their bodies, and converted their remains into soap, cakes, and other household products. She sometimes gave these items to neighbors or friends, completely unaware of what they were consuming. Her calm and friendly exterior concealed the meticulous planning and brutal violence that occurred within her walls. Leonarda's murders were methodical and ritualistic. She carefully planned each abduction, ensured privacy during the killings, and cleaned up afterward to avoid suspicion. Her belief that these acts would protect her children justified, in her mind, every detail. She kept no formal records, but witnesses and later investigators pieced together the extent of her crimes. The number of victims remains uncertain, but the brutality and calculation behind each murder are undeniable. The discovery of her crimes came in 1940, when neighbors reported strange odors and suspicious activity coming from her home. Police investigation uncovered human remains, tools used to dismember bodies, and evidence of her ritual practices. The scope of her crimes shocked Italy. Multiple victims were identified, and the horrifying details of how she processed their bodies became public knowledge. The nation was horrified that a seemingly ordinary, devoted mother could commit such atrocities. Leonarda's trial in 1946 was one of the most notorious in modern Italian history. She explained that she had been guided by mystical forces and that her murders were necessary to protect her family. Psychologists testified that she suffered from extreme superstition, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and delusions regarding death and protection. The court sentenced her to 30 years in prison and committed her to a psychiatric facility, where she remained until her death in 1970. Throughout her imprisonment, she maintained that her actions were justified, believing she had saved her children from harm. Her story is a chilling study of how fear, superstition, and obsession can destroy morality and empathy. Leonarda Cianciulli's life demonstrates that even ordinary individuals, consumed by irrational fears, can commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. The victims she murdered remain silent, but their lives and the horror of their deaths continue to haunt history. Her name is remembered not only for the grotesque methods she used, but for the terrifying insight into how fear can twist human behavior into something monstrous. Leonarda Cianciulli's story is more than a tale of murder. It is a warning of the darkness that fear can create, of how obsession with protection and survival can push ordinary people to unimaginable extremes, and of the horrors that can hide behind calm, ordinary appearances. Every ritual, every murder, every piece of soap and cake she created was a testament to a mind that had surrendered entirely to terror, leaving only cruelty behind. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a man who made ordinary streets feel unsafe, whose quiet life concealed unimaginable horror. Children disappeared in broad daylight. Parents lived in constant fear. Behind the closed doors of his small apartment in Tokyo, he committed acts of cruelty so extreme that they shook an entire nation to its core. This man was Tsutomu Miyazaki, later called the Otaku Murderer, a name that still sends chills through anyone who hears it. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born in 1962 in Japan, the youngest of 4 children in a family that seemed normal on the surface but was strained beneath. His father was a government worker, his mother a homemaker. From a very young age, Miyazaki was shy, withdrawn, and deeply isolated. He struggled to communicate with other children and became increasingly obsessed with books, horror media, and later, anime. While other children played in parks or schoolyards, he spent hours alone, immersing himself in fantastical worlds that gave him comfort but also fueled his growing detachment from reality. By his teenage years, Miyazaki's behavior had become alarming. He was socially awkward to the point of being almost invisible in public, yet in private, he developed obsessive tendencies. He collected disturbing materials, ranging from violent pornography to horror magazines, and created a world in which violence and death became familiar companions. Teachers and relatives noticed his oddities, but he was never physically violent during these years. Instead, his obsession with control, isolation, and the macabre quietly took root. After finishing school, Miyazaki lived alone in small apartments in Tokyo. His family relationships were distant and strained. He did not work steadily, and he rarely socialized. He developed compulsive routines, spending hours in libraries and stores collecting books and media about death, mutilation, and human anatomy. His obsessions were not just hobbies. They became a lens through which he viewed the world. He began to fantasize about controlling life and death, and these fantasies grew darker with each year. In the late 1980s, Miyazaki's obsession with death transformed into action. Between 1988 and 1989, he abducted and murdered at least 4 young girls, ages ranging from 4 to 7, in Tokyo. His method was both premeditated and meticulous. He would approach girls in parks or near their homes, often under the pretense of offering candy or gifts. He targeted the most vulnerable, those least likely to be missed immediately. Once he had them in his apartment, he subjected them to horrifying acts of sexual assault, physical torture, and ultimately murder. Miyazaki documented his crimes extensively. He kept photographs, drawings, and journals detailing every action. These records revealed a man who derived a deep sense of control and pleasure from the suffering of others. He planned his murders carefully, cleaning and organizing his apartment between attacks, and disposing of evidence in a way that initially made detection difficult. Despite his meticulous nature, the horror of his acts eventually left a trail that investigators could follow. The investigation was slow and painstaking. At first, police treated each disappearance separately, but a pattern began to emerge. Witnesses reported seeing a strange, thin man lurking near playgrounds and public areas where young girls played. Families of missing children became desperate, and newspapers began reporting on the possibility of a serial killer in Tokyo. Miyazaki, however, continued his murders, each time exploiting gaps in law enforcement and the trust of the community. In 1989, authorities finally gathered enough evidence to arrest him. The discovery of his photographs, journals, and other incriminating items left no doubt about his guilt. During interrogation, Miyazaki initially denied the charges, but eventually confessed to the murders in chilling detail. He described his crimes calmly, speaking of each abduction, each act of torture, and each victim as if recounting a story rather than acknowledging the humanity of the children he had killed. His demeanor shocked investigators, demonstrating his complete lack of empathy and emotional detachment. The trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki became one of the most infamous in Japanese history. Psychologists testified about his mental state, highlighting traits consistent with psychopathy, sexual sadism, and severe obsessive-compulsive behavior. The public was horrified, and the media labeled him the otaku murderer, linking his obsession with manga, anime, and horror media to his crimes. Though experts emphasized that media alone does not create killers, the moniker captured the public imagination, symbolizing a man who lived entirely in fantasy while committing unspeakable violence in reality. In 1997, after years of investigation, trial, and appeals, Miyazaki was sentenced to death. The court cited the extreme cruelty of his acts, the young age of his victims, and his total lack of remorse. He remained on death row for over a decade, a period during which psychologists continued to study his case, hoping to understand the roots of his pathology. On June 17, 2008, Tsutomu Miyazaki was executed by hanging. The aftermath of his crimes left a deep impact on Japanese society. Parents restricted their children's movements, schools implemented stricter safety measures, and law enforcement increased monitoring of individuals with violent obsessions. Miyazaki's case also fueled academic studies into the link between social isolation, obsessive behavior, and extreme psychopathy. His life remains a case study of how a deeply disturbed mind can hide in plain sight, exploiting social systems and the innocence of children. Tsutomu Miyazaki's story is a chilling reminder that evil can be quiet, polite, and unassuming. He was a man whose outward appearance was unremarkable, whose daily routine seemed mundane, yet who held in his private life a darkness so profound that it terrorized an entire city. The names of his victims live on, a haunting testament to the lives stolen by the otaku murderer, and a warning of the horrors that can lurk behind ordinary doors. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a woman who made death part of her daily life. Behind the high walls of her castle, the cries of young girls echoed in the dark. They were lured inside with promises of work and safety, but they were beaten, tortured, and left to die in ways too cruel to imagine. It is said that hundreds never came out alive. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and history remembers her as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 in the Kingdom of Hungary. From the moment she entered the world, she carried the weight of privilege and power. She belonged to one of the richest and most influential families in Europe. Her bloodline tied her to princes, cardinals, and rulers. As a child, she lived in castles, surrounded by servants and luxury. But her childhood was not filled with kindness. Life in the 16th century was brutal, and Elizabeth was exposed to that brutality early. She grew up seeing peasants punished in public squares. Criminals were whipped, branded, or mutilated. Executions were not hidden, but celebrated as a show of order and control. Servants in her household were treated as objects, beaten without mercy for mistakes. Elizabeth absorbed this environment. To her, pain became normal, cruelty became expected, and human suffering became a tool to enforce power. Unlike many women of her time, Elizabeth was highly educated. She learned to read and write in several languages, including Latin, German, and Hungarian. She studied mathematics, law, and science. Her intelligence made her stand out, but it also sharpened her sense of superiority. She began to see herself as not just noble by birth, but naturally above those around her. This mixture of intelligence, pride, and exposure to violence created the foundation for something monstrous. At the age of 15, Elizabeth married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a man feared for his cruelty on the battlefield. Their wedding united two powerful dynasties and secured Elizabeth even greater influence. She moved into her husband's castle and soon found herself in charge of vast estates. Ferenc was often away fighting wars, leaving Elizabeth to rule alone. She held authority over hundreds of servants and peasants. Whispers began almost immediately. Servants spoke of her rage, of beatings that left bruises and broken bones. A maid who made a mistake in her chores could be whipped until she bled. A disobedient girl could be locked away without food. Elizabeth's power over life and death was absolute, and she wielded it without hesitation. When her husband died in 1604, Elizabeth was 44 years old, wealthy, and fully independent. No longer restrained by marriage, her cruelty deepened. It was in these years that her crimes reached their darkest level. With the help of a small circle of trusted servants, she began to lure young peasant girls into her castles. Families were told their daughters would find work as maids. Others were simply taken under false promises. Once inside, the girls became prisoners. Witness testimony later described acts of shocking violence. Girls were struck with clubs until their bones shattered. They were cut with knives and scissors. Needles were pushed under their fingernails. They were burned with hot irons or doused in freezing water and left outside in the snow until they froze to death. Some were starved until they wasted away. It was said Elizabeth herself took part in the torment, striking them, biting their flesh, and laughing at their screams. The most infamous legend claimed that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. Whether or not this was true, the core fact remained. Young women were dying in shocking numbers. Servants spoke of bodies hidden in the castle cellars, buried in shallow graves, or burned in secret to hide the evidence. The number of victims grew so large that it could no longer be concealed. By 1609, priests began to complain about the suspicious frequency of burials of young women connected to her household. Local peasants whispered that their daughters had gone to the castle and never returned. The rumors spread wider, reaching the ears of the king himself. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation. A team of soldiers raided Elizabeth's castle. What they found shocked even hardened men. Some girls were found dead. Others were barely alive, their bodies covered in wounds, starved, and broken. The chambers of the castle bore the marks of torture. Elizabeth was immediately placed under house arrest, and her servants were dragged away for questioning. Under interrogation, her servants confessed. They described in detail the horrors they had witnessed and participated in. They told of Elizabeth beating girls until they collapsed, of needles pushed into their skin, of girls burned with irons, and of corpses stacked in secret. The number of victims they spoke of was staggering. Some claimed dozens, others spoke of hundreds. One figure reached more than 600 girls. Historians doubt the highest number, but even the lowest estimates made Elizabeth one of the most prolific killers in history. Her servants were put on trial and executed for their role in the crimes. Elizabeth, however, was too powerful and too noble to be publicly tried or executed. Instead, in 1611, she was sentenced to permanent confinement within her own castle. The windows of her chamber were bricked up, leaving only a small slit through which food could be passed. She lived in darkness and isolation, cut off from the world. For 4 years, she remained like this. In 1614, guards found her lying dead on the floor of her chamber. She was 54 years old. She was buried in her family crypt, but so much fear and hatred surrounded her name that her body was later removed, and its final resting place remains uncertain. The story of Elizabeth Bathory spread quickly across Europe. Some saw her as a monster, a woman consumed by vanity and sadism. Others believed the scale of her crimes had been exaggerated by men who envied her power and wanted her destroyed. Modern historians continue to debate the exact truth. Was she a sadistic serial killer who murdered hundreds? Or was she a victim of political conspiracy? The truth lies somewhere between legend and fact. But the evidence of dead girls, of testimony under oath, and of bodies discovered in her castle cannot be denied. Over 4 centuries later, Elizabeth Bathory is remembered as one of the most infamous women in history. Her name is tied to vampire myths, to stories of blood and eternal youth. But behind the legends lies the reality of countless young women who suffered and died under her power. Their voices were silenced by nobility, but their story lives on in the shadow of her name. This was the life and crimes of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a noble woman who turned castles into prisons, whose cruelty became legend, and whose darkness still chills the world to this day. Next story, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Luis Alfredo Garavito, a man from Colombia whose crimes against children in the 1990s shocked the entire world. His acts of violence were so widespread and so brutal that he is remembered as one of the most prolific killers in recorded history. What makes his story especially haunting is not only the scale of his crimes, but also the way he lived for years undetected, leaving entire communities devastated and fearful. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born in 1957 in a small town in Colombia. His early childhood was marked by abuse, neglect, and hardship. He grew up in a large family where poverty was a daily struggle, and his father was violent toward both him and his siblings. From an early age, Garavito experienced physical abuse, emotional neglect, and exposure to alcoholism. These experiences shaped his psychology in deep and lasting ways. He grew up feeling powerless, angry, and alienated, and these feelings would later become twisted into desires for control and domination over the most vulnerable victims. As a young man, Garavito developed a troubled personality. He was socially awkward, prone to bursts of anger, and unable to maintain stable relationships. He drifted between jobs, often working as a street vendor or laborer. He developed alcoholism, which worsened his instability. Behind his outward struggles, however, he was developing an obsession with children. His earliest assaults were attempts to gain power and control, driven by a combination of anger, desire, and psychological disturbance. Over time, these assaults escalated into a horrifying pattern of murder. Garavito's method was both calculated and deceptive. He targeted young boys, often from poor families or those living on the streets. Many of his victims were between the ages of 6 and 16. He would approach them with offers of food, money, or work, sometimes pretending to be a charitable man who wanted to help. Once he gained their trust, he would lure them to secluded areas such as fields, abandoned buildings, or hidden roadsides. There he would bind, assault, torture, and kill them, often using knives or other sharp objects. His crimes were marked by extreme cruelty, reflecting not only his desire to dominate, but also deep-seated sadistic impulses. What made Garavito particularly dangerous was his ability to move frequently and adapt his methods. Colombia in the 1990s was experiencing widespread social turmoil, poverty, and armed conflict. Thousands of children were living on the streets, making them easy prey. Many of the families were too poor to pursue investigations, and authorities were often overwhelmed with other crises. This environment allowed Garavito to operate for years without drawing major attention. By the mid-1990s, reports of missing boys were rising dramatically. Communities began to notice patterns. Bodies of children were found in clusters, often in rural areas. Many showed signs of torture and mutilation. The level of violence was shocking, and fear began to spread as families realized a predator was targeting their children. Still, it took years for authorities to connect the cases and identify Garavito as the suspect. The breakthrough came in 1999 when police discovered a mass grave containing the remains of multiple children. Evidence collected at the site, including clothing and personal items, led investigators to track Garavito's movements. Around the same time, a boy who had survived one of his attacks provided descriptions that matched him. Police began to close in, and Garavito was eventually arrested. During interrogation, Garavito confessed in chilling detail. He admitted to murdering 140 children and suggested the number might be even higher. Later investigations linked him to over 170 victims, though some estimates placed the true figure at more than 200. His calm and matter-of-fact descriptions of the crimes horrified investigators. He explained how he chose his victims, how he gained their trust, and how he killed them. He showed no real remorse, only a detached recounting of events as if he were describing a routine. Garavito's trial was one of the most significant in Colombian history. The scale of his crimes was unprecedented. Families of victims filled the courtroom, demanding justice and answers. Psychologists testified about his severe antisocial personality disorder, his sadistic impulses, and his compulsive behavior. He was described as a predator driven by uncontrollable urges, but also as a calculating manipulator who carefully planned his actions. In 1999, Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, the longest sentence ever given in Colombia at the time. However, under Colombian law, the maximum time an individual can serve is 40 years. This caused outrage among the public, as many felt it was not sufficient punishment for the scale of his crimes. Authorities later adjusted the maximum to 60 years for special cases, but it still meant that Garavito could not technically serve the full length of a sentence. While in prison, Garavito occasionally cooperated with investigators, helping them locate burial sites of his victims. Even so, his behavior in prison reflected the same manipulative personality he had always shown. He sometimes portrayed himself as repentant, asking for forgiveness, while at other times he remained cold and detached. Families of victims struggled with the knowledge that the man responsible for so much pain would never face the full measure of justice. Garavito's crimes had a lasting impact on Colombia. They highlighted the vulnerabilities of street children and the failures of institutions meant to protect them. His actions forced reforms in how authorities track missing children, investigate serial crimes, and provide resources for poor families. Nonprofit organizations and child protection groups grew stronger in the aftermath, determined to prevent another tragedy on such a scale. Psychologists studying Garavito's case have described him as one of the most extreme examples of sadistic serial killers. His lack of empathy, his ability to deceive, and his willingness to kill repeatedly made him extraordinarily dangerous. The fact that he targeted children, the most vulnerable members of society, made his crimes especially horrifying. He remains one of the most studied cases in criminal psychology, both for the sheer number of victims and the systematic way in which he carried out his murders. Luis Alfredo Garavito died in 2023 while still in prison, reportedly from natural causes. His death brought a measure of closure, though for many families it was too late. The memory of the children he killed continues to haunt Colombia, and his story remains a warning about the depths of human cruelty and the need for vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. The story of Garavito is not just about one man's crimes. It is also about the social and economic conditions that made those crimes possible. Poverty, neglect, and weak institutions allowed him to thrive for years. His actions forced Colombia to confront those weaknesses, and though progress has been made, the pain of his victims' families remains a permanent scar. Today, Garavito is remembered as one of the worst killers in history. His crimes stand as a reminder of what can happen when society fails to protect its children. The lessons from his case continue to inform criminal justice systems around the world, ensuring that the suffering he caused is never forgotten. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Marc Dutroux, a man whose actions in Belgium during the 1980s and 1990s revealed not only the extent of his cruelty, but also exposed failures in the country's police and justice systems. His crimes shocked an entire nation, and his name remains one of the most infamous in Europe's criminal history. Marc Dutroux was born in Brussels in 1956. He was the eldest of 5 children in a family marked by instability and neglect. His parents were both teachers, but they were harsh, distant, and unable to provide warmth. At home, arguments were frequent and emotional care was lacking. By the time Dutroux reached adolescence, his parents divorced, and he spent much of his teenage years drifting between relatives and institutions. The lack of structure and affection played a key role in shaping his personality. Teachers described him as intelligent but manipulative. He often lied, stole, and tried to bend situations to his advantage. During his teenage years, Dutroux began to show disturbing tendencies. He was fascinated by control and domination. He frequently stole from classmates and bullied weaker peers. By the age of 18, he had already been arrested several times for theft and auto crimes. These early brushes with the law did little to deter him, and he quickly gained a reputation as a cunning but untrustworthy young man. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dutroux's crimes escalated. He began abducting and assaulting young girls, using manipulation and physical force to gain control. In 1986, he was arrested and convicted of kidnapping and assaulting 5 girls. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. At the time, psychiatrists who evaluated him described him as manipulative, narcissistic, and dangerous, with a high risk of reoffending. Despite this, Dutroux served only 3 years before being released on parole in 1989. This decision would later haunt Belgium, as it allowed him to continue his predatory activities. Upon his release, Dutroux carefully constructed a double life. To the outside world, he appeared to be a tradesman, working as an electrician and handyman. He lived in a modest home with his wife, Michelle Martin, whom he had married in 1983. They had children together, and to neighbors he seemed like an eccentric but ordinary man. In reality, however, Dutroux was building a network of properties across Belgium, many of which contained secret chambers. In one of his most disturbing acts of preparation, Dutroux built underground cells in the basements of his homes. These chambers were hidden behind false walls and secured with heavy locks. They were small, dark, and designed to hold young girls captive. He stocked them with food, water, and mattresses. His planning showed methodical premeditation and a chilling level of organization. Throughout the early 1990s, Dutroux resumed his cycle of abduction. His method was simple but effective. He would drive around areas where children walked home from school or gather with friends, and he would lure or force them into his vehicle. Once in his control, they were taken to the hidden chambers and held in captivity. There, they endured prolonged suffering, including assault and psychological torment. Dutroux was not acting entirely alone. His wife, Michelle Martin, played a crucial role in his crimes. She sometimes lured victims by pretending to offer them help. She also fed and monitored the imprisoned girls while Dutrix was away. Other accomplices assisted in various ways, though none were as central as Martin. This collaboration made his crimes even more horrifying, as they showed a shared willingness to inflict suffering on vulnerable children. Some of the girls Dutrix captured did not survive their ordeal. Investigators later discovered that 2 victims left unattended while Dutrix was briefly imprisoned on another offense, died of starvation in his basement. Michelle Martin, though aware of their presence, failed to intervene or provide food. These deaths highlighted not only Dutrix's cruelty, but also Martin's complicity. The scale of Dutrix's crimes might never have been fully uncovered if not for a series of investigative breakthroughs in 1996. After reports of another attempted abduction, police linked Dutrix to the crime. When his properties were searched, investigators made a chilling discovery. Behind false walls and beneath floors, they found hidden chambers where children had been held captive. Some victims were rescued alive, while the remains of others were unearthed. Authorities also recovered videotapes Dutrix had made, documenting his crimes and confirming the extent of his actions. The revelations shocked Belgium to its core. The public was horrified not only by the brutality of the crimes, but also by how many opportunities had been missed to stop Dutrix earlier. Neighbors had reported suspicious activity, including sounds of children crying, but searches of his home had been careless. In one instance, police officers stood just feet above where 2 girls were imprisoned but failed to discover the hidden compartment. As news spread, Belgium erupted in anger. The people demanded accountability, not only for the crimes, but for the repeated failures of the justice system. In October 1996, hundreds of thousands of Belgians took to the streets in what became known as the White March. Citizens dressed in white and carried white balloons as symbols of innocence lost. It was one of the largest public demonstrations in Belgian history, reflecting the collective grief and outrage of a nation betrayed by its institutions. The trial of Mark Dutrix began in 2004, nearly a decade after his arrest. It lasted months and was followed closely by the international press. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors gave haunting testimony of their captivity. Families of victims described years of anguish. The videotapes and journals provided direct proof of his guilt. Dutrix attempted to manipulate the trial by claiming he had been part of a larger network of criminals involved in trafficking. These claims sparked conspiracy theories and added to public distrust, but they were never fully substantiated. Ultimately, Dutrix was convicted of multiple murders, kidnappings, and assaults. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His wife, Michelle Martin, was also convicted and sentenced to 30 years, though she later received parole in 2012, a decision that once again outraged the public. The aftermath of the Dutrix case was far-reaching. It led to reforms in the Belgian police and judicial system, including better coordination between agencies, stricter sentencing for dangerous offenders, and improved procedures for handling missing persons. The case became a symbol of both the depths of human cruelty and the necessity of institutional accountability. Psychologists who studied Dutrix described him as a manipulative, narcissistic predator. He exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder, with a total lack of empathy for his victims. He was motivated by control and domination, seeing his victims not as human beings, but as objects to satisfy his desires. His ability to live an outwardly ordinary life while secretly committing such atrocities remains one of the most chilling aspects of his story. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Rodney Alcala, a man whose charm, intelligence, and outward appearance concealed a pattern of violence and manipulation that terrorized women for decades. Known as the dating game killer, his case stands as one of the most chilling examples of how a predator can operate in plain sight while deceiving nearly everyone around him. Rodney James Alcala was born in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. His early childhood was marked by instability. When he was young, his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise the children alone. They relocated to Los Angeles, where Alcala grew up. Accounts from his youth describe him as intelligent, artistic, and gifted in school. He showed talent in photography and had an ability to draw people toward him with his personality. Yet beneath this outward image lay a growing tendency toward manipulation and control. Alcala joined the United States Army at the age of 17. He was stationed as a clerk, but his time in the military ended abruptly. In 1964, after suffering what was described as a nervous breakdown, he deserted his post. Military psychologists later diagnosed him with antisocial personality traits, and he was discharged on medical grounds. This episode revealed the instability and psychological issues that would continue to shape his life. By the late 1960s, Alcala had begun targeting women and children. In 1968, in Los Angeles, he committed one of his first known assaults. He lured an 8-year-old girl into his apartment and attacked her. A passerby intervened, and the girl survived, though severely injured. Alcala fled the state and was placed on the FBI's most wanted list. He adopted new identities, enrolled in college in New York, and even studied film under the famous director Roman Polanski. This ability to shift identities and blend into new environments became a hallmark of his predatory style. Eventually, Alcala was arrested and convicted for the 1968 assault, but the legal system at the time imposed light consequences. He served a short sentence and was released on parole in the early 1970s. Despite the clear evidence of his danger to society, parole boards granted him freedom multiple times. This repeated leniency allowed Alcala to continue his cycle of violence. Throughout the 1970s, Alcala refined his methods. He presented himself as a professional photographer, often approaching women and offering to take their pictures for modeling portfolios. He carried a camera and used his charm to gain trust. Many women agreed, not realizing that behind the lens was a predator who was studying, manipulating, and ultimately hunting them. Thousands of photographs were later found, showing women, teenagers, and children in posed and candid situations. Some of the individuals in these photographs remain unidentified to this day, raising chilling questions about the full extent of his crimes. Alcala's outward persona grew increasingly convincing. In 1978, he even appeared as a contestant on the popular television program, The Dating Game. On national television, he smiled, joked, and impressed the female contestant with his witty answers. He won the episode and was chosen for a date, though the woman later declined after sensing something unsettling about him. The fact that a serial predator could stand on stage and charm a national audience while actively committing crimes earned him the nickname the Dating Game Killer. Behind this facade, Alcala's crimes were escalating. He was linked to murders across California, New York, and possibly other states. His victims were often young women, though investigators later connected him to children as well. The killings followed a pattern of manipulation, assault, and strangulation. Survivors described how he would sometimes strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, then allow them to recover briefly before repeating the act. This sadistic method revealed his desire for total control over life and death. One of his known victims was Jill Barkham, an 18-year-old runaway found murdered in Los Angeles in 1977. Another was Georgia Wickstead, a 27-year-old nurse whose body was discovered in 1978. Later victims included Charlotte Lamb, Jill Parento, and 12-year-old Robin Samso, whose disappearance and murder in 1979 finally brought Alcala into the full focus of law enforcement. The Samso case became the turning point. Robin disappeared while riding her bicycle to ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. Her remains were found 12 days later. Witnesses recalled seeing her with a man who matched Alcala's description and noted the presence of a camera. Police searched his storage locker, uncovering jewelry, keepsakes, and thousands of photographs. These items linked him to multiple victims and provided evidence of his predatory behavior. Alcala was arrested in 1979 and charged with Robin Samso's murder. His first trial led to a conviction, but it was overturned on appeal due to procedural issues. A second conviction followed, but was again overturned. It was not until 2010, after advances in DNA technology, that prosecutors secured a comprehensive conviction against him for 5 murders committed in California between 1977 and 1979. DNA evidence also linked him to additional crimes in New York and elsewhere. In total, investigators estimate that Alcala may have killed dozens of people, though the exact number remains unknown. During his trials, Alcala's behavior reflected his narcissism and manipulative tendencies. In his later trial, he chose to represent himself, questioning witnesses and even addressing the jury directly. At times he played recordings of the song Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant, seemingly mocking the proceedings. His lack of remorse and his insistence on controlling the courtroom underscored the psychological traits that had fueled his crimes. In 2010, Rodney Alcala was sentenced to death in California for the murders of 5 women and girls. Additional convictions followed in New York, where he was sentenced to 25 years to life for 2 more killings. Despite the convictions, law enforcement believes that Alcala's victim count was far higher, possibly reaching into the dozens or more. The photographs discovered in his storage unit remain a haunting archive, with many individuals still unidentified, leaving families to wonder whether their missing loved ones may have been among his victims. Alcala's health declined in prison, and he remained on death row for over a decade. In July 2021, he died of natural causes at the age of 77 while still awaiting execution. His death closed a chapter on his life, but left many unanswered questions about the true scale of his crimes. The case of Rodney Alcala serves as a chilling reminder of how predators can manipulate appearances to conceal their true nature. He was intelligent, articulate, and charming enough to convince television producers, parole boards, and even casual acquaintances that he was safe. Yet behind this mask, he was one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Anatoly Onoprienko, a man whose actions in Ukraine during the 1990s earned him the names the Terminator and the Beast of Ukraine. His crimes were so shocking in their scale and brutality that they left entire towns in fear and reshaped how the country thought about violence. Anatoly Onoprienko was born in 1959 in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine. His childhood was marked by neglect and hardship. When he was still very young, his mother died, and his father, unable to care for him, placed him in an orphanage. Growing up without a stable family or guidance, he developed deep feelings of abandonment and resentment. The orphanage system in the Soviet era was harsh, and Anatoly learned to survive through isolation and cruelty. Teachers and other children described him as withdrawn, but also prone to sudden bursts of anger. These early experiences played a major role in shaping his psychology. He grew up believing the world was hostile and uncaring, and in time, he would turn that belief into violence. As a young man, Anatoly briefly joined the Soviet military, but he did not last long in disciplined environments. He drifted from job to job, never forming lasting relationships. By the 1980s, he began to commit small crimes, burglaries, and thefts. He also traveled through Europe for a time, where he may have observed or even practiced violent crimes that were never discovered. What is clear is that by the early 1990s, back in Ukraine, he had decided to pursue murder on a scale almost without precedent. Onoprienko's method was chilling. He would select isolated houses, often in rural villages, where families lived far from neighbors. Armed with a shotgun or other weapons, he would break into the homes at night, kill everyone inside, and then set fire to the house to destroy evidence. He murdered entire families, men, women, and children, leaving no survivors. His attacks were often random, which created widespread panic because no one could predict where he would strike next. Unlike killers who target specific victims, Onoprienko's violence was indiscriminate. This made him even more terrifying. Between 1989 and 1996, he murdered at least 52 people, though some investigators believe the true number could have been higher. His crimes were methodical, yet also impulsive. Sometimes he would kill simply because a house seemed like an easy target. In other cases, he left behind small signs of planning, such as stealing weapons or vehicles. The randomness of his choices made the investigations difficult. In Ukraine during the early 1990s, the police and security forces were struggling. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left the country in turmoil. Institutions were weak, resources were scarce, and crime was rising across the nation. Onoprienko exploited this chaos. For years, he managed to avoid capture, moving quietly from one region to another. Each new set of murders caused fear to spread. Families locked themselves in their homes at night. Villages organized patrols, but it did little to stop him. The investigation into his crimes was one of the most complex in Ukrainian history. Initially, police suspected several different individuals, since the crimes were so widespread and brutal that it seemed impossible for one man to be responsible. For a time, attention even fell on innocent suspects who were wrongfully detained. This only deepened public frustration and fear. The breakthrough came in 1996, after a series of particularly brutal murders. Investigators began to see a clearer pattern. Tips from locals led them to Onoprienko, who had been living with a girlfriend at the time. When police raided his home, they discovered weapons, stolen property for victims, and detailed evidence linking him to the killings. Confronted with overwhelming proof, Onoprienko confessed. His confession was chilling in its calmness. He spoke about the murders as if they were simple acts of necessity, showing little remorse. He explained his methods step by step, acknowledging the families he had destroyed. His trial in 1998 was one of the most publicized in Ukrainian history. The courtroom was packed with families of victims, journalists, and officials. People wanted to understand how a single man could commit such atrocities. Throughout the proceedings, Onoprienko remained detached. He admitted to 52 murders, describing them in detail. Psychologists evaluated him and concluded that he showed traits of severe antisocial personality disorder. He lacked empathy, exhibited extreme aggression, and was driven by impulses he claimed he could not control. The court sentenced him to death, the maximum penalty in Ukraine at the time. However, shortly after, Ukraine declared a moratorium on the death penalty in line with European human rights agreements. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. He was sent to a maximum security prison, where he spent the rest of his days. In 2013, Anatoly Onoprienko died of heart failure in his cell at the age of 54. The aftermath of his crimes left deep scars. Communities that lost entire families struggled for years. The Ukrainian justice system faced criticism for its failures during the investigation. The case also highlighted the difficulties faced by countries in transition, where weak institutions allow violent individuals to exploit chaos. For many, Onoprienko became a symbol of the darkest possibilities of human nature. Today, his name remains one of the most feared in Eastern Europe. His crimes are studied as an example of how random, large-scale violence can terrorize entire regions. The memory of his victims lives on, and the story of the Beast of Ukraine serves as a grim reminder of the devastation a single individual can cause when unchecked by law and society. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Javed Iqbal, a man whose actions in Lahore, Pakistan, during the late 1990s shocked the world and revealed a level of cruelty almost impossible to comprehend. His crimes left families devastated, communities terrified, and the nation struggling to understand how such horrors could occur. Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, Pakistan. His childhood was marked by neglect, social isolation, and early exposure to moral confusion. While details of his early family life are limited, accounts suggest that he was an intelligent child, academically capable, but socially withdrawn. He struggled to form normal attachments and demonstrated early tendencies toward obsessive and controlling behavior. Teachers recalled that he often appeared detached from the emotions of those around him. and he rarely formed lasting friendships. As a young adult, Iqbal's intelligence became more pronounced. He was a diligent student and pursued work in commerce and small business. Despite his outward appearance of normalcy, he was developing a dark fascination with control and domination. He began to view vulnerable children as objects to manipulate and exploit. This fixation escalated in secrecy as he simultaneously maintained a facade of being a polite, educated, and law-abiding citizen. In the early 1990s, Javed Iqbal began committing his crimes. He targeted street children and orphans, often luring them with promises of shelter, food, and money. Many of his victims were boys who had been abandoned or marginalized, making them particularly vulnerable. Once he gained their trust, Iqbal would assault, torture, and ultimately murder them. His methods were horrifyingly methodical. He often strangled his victims and then disposed of their bodies in secret locations. The scale of Iqbal's crimes grew rapidly. Over a period of approximately 2 years, he murdered at least 100 boys, though some estimates suggest the number could have been even higher. To cover his tracks, he employed techniques to prevent identification, including dissolving bodies in chemical solutions. He kept detailed notes and a notebook listing his victims, demonstrating both obsession and a chilling sense of pride in his actions. Iqbal's crimes went undetected for years, largely because he targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Street children, orphans, and those without families were unlikely to be reported missing promptly, giving him the ability to continue without immediate consequence. He was meticulous in maintaining appearances, presenting himself as a respectable businessman and responsible citizen. This duality allowed him to operate in plain sight while committing acts of unimaginable horror. The turning point in the investigation came in 1999 when police discovered evidence connecting Iqbal to several missing children. A tip-off led authorities to his residence in Lahore, where they found his notebooks, chemical containers, and other incriminating evidence. The scale of the documentation revealed the full extent of his crimes, listing hundreds of names and demonstrating a level of premeditation that was staggering. When confronted, Javed Iqbal confessed to his murders. He described his actions in detail, explaining how he would lure children, commit assaults, and then dispose of their bodies. He showed no apparent remorse, speaking about his crimes as if they were a logical sequence of events. Psychologists later evaluated him and concluded that he displayed severe antisocial personality disorder, sadistic tendencies, and a profound lack of empathy. His ability to compartmentalize normal life from his violent acts exemplified the psychological profile of an organized and calculating serial killer. Iqbal was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, abuse, and sexual assault. The trial was a national sensation, drawing attention not only to the crimes themselves, but also to systemic failures in protecting vulnerable populations. Families of victims provided testimony that was harrowing in its detail, recounting the years of fear and uncertainty. The media extensively covered the trial, which brought to light both the depravity of Iqbal's actions and the social context that allowed him to operate. During the trial, Javed Iqbal continued to display manipulative behavior. He attempted to challenge evidence, provide alternate narratives, and use his intelligence to complicate proceedings. Nevertheless, the overwhelming evidence, including his detailed victim records and physical evidence, ensured a conviction. The court sentenced him to death. The verdict was widely supported by the public, who saw it as necessary justice for the scale of his crimes. However, before his execution could be carried out, Javed Iqbal died in police custody in 2001. He had reportedly hanged himself in his cell, bringing an abrupt end to his life, but leaving many questions unresolved. His death prevented a full legal closure for many families, though the documentation he left behind offered evidence of the magnitude of his crimes and provided closure in terms of identifying his victims. The aftermath of Iqbal's case had profound implications for Pakistan. Law enforcement agencies faced criticism for failing to detect his crimes earlier, particularly in communities with large populations of street children and orphans. The case prompted reforms in child protection policies, efforts to improve monitoring of vulnerable populations, and initiatives to educate the public about the risks of exploitation. Social workers, psychologists, and law enforcement used the case to develop better strategies for prevention and intervention. Psychological studies of Javed Iqbal highlighted the complexities of his mind. He was not a spontaneous or impulsive killer. His intelligence allowed him to plan meticulously, manipulate those around him, and commit crimes without immediate detection. His lack of remorse, combined with his ability to present a normal facade, made him extraordinarily dangerous. He serves as an example of how predators can exploit societal vulnerabilities while remaining hidden in plain sight. Today, the story of Javed Iqbal remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of crime. His actions destroyed lives, terrorized communities, and revealed the darkest aspects of human behavior. Yet his crimes also prompted important changes in child protection, policing, and public awareness, ensuring that some good emerged from the tragedy. His name is remembered as a cautionary symbol of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the protection of the most vulnerable members of society. Javed Iqbal's story is not just a tale of murder. It is a haunting reminder of how intelligence, charm, and manipulation can be weaponized to commit acts of profound evil. It illustrates the vulnerabilities in society that allow predators to flourish and underscores the enduring importance of justice, protection, and awareness. Even decades later, the victims he claimed are remembered, and the lessons of his crimes continue to inform law enforcement and child protection practices around the world. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Charles Cullen, a man who spent decades killing patients under his care while working as a nurse in hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. His crimes revealed a horrifying abuse of trust and exposed weaknesses in the healthcare system that allowed him to continue for years undetected. Charles Edmund Cullen was born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey. His childhood was marked by instability, emotional neglect, and early exposure to social and psychological challenges. He was described as a quiet, introverted child, often withdrawing from others. He showed signs of depression and struggled to form healthy emotional connections. Despite these difficulties, he was intelligent and capable, traits that would later help him evade detection for years. Cullen trained as a nurse, completing his education in the late 1970s. He quickly found work in hospitals, where he initially performed his duties competently. However, colleagues noted that he sometimes exhibited mood swings and occasional outbursts of anger. These early warning signs were not taken seriously at the time, as he appeared generally professional and maintained a quiet demeanor. Cullen's killing began in the late 1980s. He started by administering lethal doses of medications to patients, often targeting those who were elderly, critically ill, or otherwise vulnerable. His methods were subtle, making it appear as though patients had died from natural causes or complications of their existing illnesses. This ability to blend his actions into the expected patterns of hospital mortality allowed him to avoid suspicion. Over the next 2 decades, Cullen moved between hospitals, often leaving positions before colleagues noticed patterns in patient deaths. In total, he worked at more than a dozen medical facilities. Each move allowed him to continue killing without raising red flags. Hospitals did not communicate effectively about suspicious deaths, and oversight was minimal, which enabled Cullen to continue his killing spree for years. It is believed that Charles Cullen murdered at least 40 patients, though the exact number may be higher. Victims included both men and women, primarily in their elderly years or suffering from serious medical conditions. His method of killing primarily involved the administration of overdoses of medications, such as digoxin, insulin, and other cardiac drugs. These overdoses often caused heart failure or sudden death, and because the patients were already vulnerable, the deaths appeared consistent with medical expectations. Cullen's motivations were complex and sometimes contradictory. In interviews after his arrest, he claimed he derived a sense of satisfaction from ending suffering, though investigators rejected this as a rationalization. Psychologists described him as having antisocial personality traits, including a lack of empathy, chronic manipulation, and a willingness to kill without remorse. He displayed both careful planning and opportunism, selecting victims based on accessibility and vulnerability. The first serious investigation into Cullen's activities began in the late 1990s when hospital administrators and colleagues noticed unusually high death rates in units where he worked. Patterns emerged linking sudden cardiac deaths and unexplained overdoses to patients under his care. The investigation revealed that Cullen had been able to exploit weaknesses in hospital reporting systems and the lack of coordination between institutions. Despite early suspicions, no arrests were made until he confessed voluntarily during a police investigation in 2003. Cullen's confession stunned authorities. He admitted to killing dozens of patients across multiple hospitals, providing detailed accounts of how he administered lethal doses and how he avoided detection. He explained that he had moved frequently to avoid scrutiny and that he had chosen victims strategically. His calm recounting of these murders was chilling, revealing both his meticulous planning and the ease with which he had circumvented oversight. The trial and investigation that followed were extraordinary in their scope. Prosecutors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania worked to understand the full extent of Cullen's crimes, interviewing colleagues, reviewing medical records, and analyzing patient deaths over decades. The legal proceedings focused not only on the murders themselves, but also on systemic failures in the healthcare system that allowed a nurse to kill patients over such an extended period. In 2006, Charles Cullen pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and attempted murder as part of a plea agreement. The agreement was designed to avoid lengthy trials while ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms, ensuring that he would never be released. Cullen's admission, while providing closure for some families, also left lingering questions about the total number of victims. Many cases remained unresolved, and investigators continue to believe that his death toll may be higher than officially confirmed. The aftermath of Cullen's crimes prompted widespread reforms in healthcare oversight. Hospitals implemented stricter monitoring of medication administration, improved reporting systems, and mandatory reviews of unusual patient deaths. Regulatory bodies strengthened procedures to prevent similar abuses of trust in the future. Cullen's case became a central study in criminal psychology, medical ethics, and hospital administration, emphasizing the importance of vigilance and accountability in healthcare settings. Psychologists studying Charles Cullen concluded that his ability to maintain a professional facade while committing murders reflected deep-seated antisocial tendencies. He demonstrated remarkable patience, control, and cunning, traits that allowed him to manipulate his environment and evade detection. His actions highlighted the vulnerability of patients in institutional care and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority. Charles Cullen died in prison in 2021. His life and crimes remain a stark reminder of the potential for human cruelty to hide behind ordinary appearances and trusted positions. The victims he took are remembered through ongoing investigations, memorials, and studies designed to prevent future tragedies. Cullen's story is a cautionary tale about the need for oversight, ethical responsibility, and constant vigilance in any institution where lives are entrusted to others. The story of Charles Cullen is not only one of murder, but also one of betrayal, exploitation, and systemic failure. He turned his position of trust into an instrument of death, leaving families devastated and communities shaken. His crimes changed how hospitals and regulators approach patient safety, serving as a haunting reminder that evil can sometimes hide behind the most ordinary faces and places. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Leonard Lake, a man whose carefully planned and horrifying actions terrorized Northern California during the 1980s and revealed the terrifying potential of human cruelty. Leonard Lake was born in 1945 in San Francisco, California. From an early age, his life was marked by instability, isolation, and difficulty forming meaningful social connections. Neighbors and family later recalled that he was a shy and withdrawn child, prone to spending long hours alone. He exhibited early interests in firearms, military tactics, and survival techniques, often practicing with small weapons and reading extensively about combat and control. These interests were not unusual in isolation, but combined with his solitary tendencies and fascination with dominance, they became early indicators of darker impulses. As a teenager, Lake struggled socially and academically. He experienced rejection and bullying from peers, which deepened his sense of alienation. Reports suggest that he began exhibiting controlling and obsessive behaviors during adolescence. He also developed an early interest in pornography and sexual fantasy, particularly those involving domination and control. These patterns of thought and behavior would become central to his criminal life. Lake briefly served in the United States Marine Corps. During his time in the military, he gained skills in survival, firearms, and discipline. However, he failed to integrate these skills into a conventional civilian life. Instead, they were later repurposed to support his violent fantasies. After leaving the military, he moved frequently, taking odd jobs, avoiding long-term commitments, and seeking isolation whenever possible. This transient lifestyle gave him the opportunity to study communities, observe routines, and find potential victims without attracting attention. In the mid-1970s, Leonard Lake met Charles Ng, a younger man who shared some of his interests in violence, control, and fantasy. Their partnership became central to the crimes that would later define Lake's legacy. Together, they developed a system for abducting, imprisoning, and killing victims. The two men complemented each other. Lake was methodical, obsessive, and organized, while Ng provided energy and a willingness to participate in acts of violence. Lake's most notorious act was the construction of a hidden bunker on a property he purchased in Wilseyville, California. The bunker was carefully designed to imprison victims, store weapons, and allow him to carry out his crimes in complete isolation. It included locks, chains, and other implements to control victims' movements. Lake kept detailed journals, photographs, and lists documenting his fantasies, his methods, and his plans. This level of organization demonstrated a high degree of premeditation and forethought, making his crimes particularly chilling. Lake targeted women who were vulnerable and could be manipulated or overpowered. He lured victims using promises of work, shelter, or companionship, exploiting trust to gain control. Once abducted, victims were subjected to confinement, assault, and often murder. He frequently videotaped his acts, creating a record of the terror he inflicted, which later provided investigators with evidence of his premeditated cruelty. He often employed a combination of restraint, coercion, and psychological manipulation to maintain control, displaying traits consistent with sexual sadism and antisocial personality disorder. During the period of his criminal activity, the public remained largely unaware of the danger he posed. Communities in Northern California were left shocked when his crimes were finally uncovered. Families of missing persons struggled for years without answers, and law enforcement initially faced difficulty connecting disappearances that occurred across county lines. Lake's careful planning, isolated locations, and transient movements allowed him to evade detection for an extended period. The investigation intensified in 1985 after Charles Ng was detained on an unrelated weapons charge. Under questioning, Ng led authorities to Lake's Wilseyville property. There, investigators discovered the hidden bunker, containing human remains, personal effects, weapons, and detailed records of Lake's activities. The evidence revealed the horrifying scale and systematic nature of his crimes, including multiple murders, assaults, and abductions. Authorities confirmed that Lake had killed numerous victims over several years, although the full number may never be known. Psychological analysis of Leonard Lake after his death highlighted the extreme antisocial tendencies, sexual sadism, and obsessive need for control that defined his behavior. He demonstrated the ability to maintain an outwardly ordinary persona while carrying out acts of extraordinary cruelty. His meticulous planning, attention to detail, and creation of a secure facility for his crimes set him apart from impulsive offenders. Lake operated in a calculated and methodical manner, combining patience, observation, and planning to ensure the success of his attacks. Faced with imminent arrest, Leonard Lake chose to end his own life in 1985. His death prevented a complete legal reckoning, but Charles Ng was subsequently prosecuted and convicted for the crimes they had committed together. The trial revealed the full extent of Lake's predatory behavior, the meticulous planning behind his acts, and the suffering inflicted upon his victims. Families of the victims described the trauma and fear that had haunted them for years, and investigators detailed the painstaking work required to uncover and understand Lake's methods. The aftermath of Leonard Lake's crimes had profound and lasting consequences. Law enforcement agencies reviewed and improved practices related to missing persons, interagency cooperation, and tracking transient offenders. His case became a central study in criminal psychology, illustrating how a person could combine outward normalcy with calculated, methodical violence in private. It also prompted greater awareness of the potential for organized predatory behavior, highlighting the importance of vigilance and forensic investigation. Leonard Lake's story is a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty. He combined intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning to commit acts of extreme violence. He preyed on the vulnerable, exploited trust, and created a hidden world where terror could unfold without interruption. Even decades after his death, his crimes continue to serve as a case study in psychology, criminal investigation, and the consequences of predatory behavior. The meticulousness of his planning, the horror of his actions, and the enduring trauma experienced by survivors and families mark Leonard Lake as one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Yang Xinhai, a man whose brutal and methodical killings shook rural China and left a legacy of fear that still lingers today. Yang Xinhai was born in 1968 in Hunan Province, China. From a young age, his life was marked by hardship and social isolation. He grew up in a poor family, with parents struggling to provide for their children. Yang was a quiet, withdrawn child, often spending long hours alone. Neighbors recalled that he was physically small for his age and frequently bullied by other children. These early experiences of rejection and isolation contributed to a growing sense of resentment and anger. As a teenager, Yang struggled academically and socially. He dropped out of school early and began drifting from place to place, taking odd jobs wherever he could. His early adult years were marked by petty theft and occasional violence. Reports later revealed that he had committed assaults and burglaries before escalating to more serious crimes. Experts believe that his early experiences of poverty, neglect, and social marginalization combined with latent violent tendencies to form the foundation for his later predatory behavior. Yang's adult life was transient. He traveled extensively across rural China, often taking temporary labor jobs. This mobility gave him the opportunity to observe and study the routines of villages and communities. He developed a methodical approach to selecting victims. Typically, he targeted isolated households in small towns or remote villages, where people lived alone or in small family units. He studied patterns, watching the comings and goings of people and noting when homes would be empty or vulnerable. Beginning in the late 1990s, Yang's crimes escalated into a spree of extreme violence. He would enter homes late at night, often using brute force to gain access. His attacks were sudden, brutal, and meticulously executed. Victims were usually killed with hammers, axes, or knives. There was little warning, and the violence was overwhelming. Entire families were sometimes murdered, leaving behind scenes of terror and devastation. He was careful to avoid leaving evidence that could easily identify him, frequently wearing gloves and taking precautions to avoid detection. The scale and pattern of Yang's crimes caused widespread fear in rural communities. Villagers were terrified to be alone at night. People began to lock doors and keep watch in groups, but the unpredictability of his attacks made the fear pervasive. Authorities were initially unable to connect the murders, partly due to the geographic spread of his attacks. He operated across multiple provinces, which made investigation coordination difficult and slowed the identification of a pattern. Yang's psychological profile was disturbing. Experts who later studied his case identified traits consistent with extreme antisocial personality disorder. He demonstrated a total lack of empathy, deriving satisfaction from the suffering of others. He was methodical, patient, and highly organized in his approach. Unlike many criminals who act impulsively, Yang planned his attacks with precision. He would observe, wait for opportunities, and strike when victims were most vulnerable. His calm demeanor in public and transient lifestyle allowed him to blend into communities while committing violent acts in private. Authorities eventually pieced together the pattern of killings in the early 2000s. Investigators cross-referenced missing persons reports, unusual deaths, and witness accounts. Breakthroughs came when survivors and eyewitnesses provided descriptions of a suspicious man seen near crime scenes. Law enforcement used a combination of interviews, crime scene reconstruction, and emerging forensic methods to track his movements. Yang Xinhai was finally arrested in 2003. Evidence linked him to at least 67 murders and multiple assaults, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Chinese history. The trial revealed the horrifying scope of his crimes, the meticulous planning involved, and the terror he had inflicted on countless communities. Witnesses recounted their fear and trauma, survivors described narrow escapes, and investigators detailed the painstaking work required to apprehend him. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Yang remained calm during proceedings, showing little emotion or remorse. The sentence was carried out in 2004, bringing an official end to his spree of violence. Yet the impact of his crimes continued to resonate. Families mourned lost relatives, communities took years to recover their sense of security, and law enforcement incorporated lessons from the case into methods for tracking transient offenders and connecting widely dispersed crimes. The story of Yang Xinhai is a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty. His ability to operate undetected for years, the meticulousness of his planning, and the sheer brutality of his crimes make him one of the most terrifying figures in modern criminal history. He targeted the most vulnerable, struck without warning, and left a trail of destruction that shaped communities and criminal investigation practices for years to come. Even today, his crimes are studied in China and internationally as examples of how poverty, social isolation, and unchecked violent tendencies can combine to create a predator capable of extreme destruction. The terror he instilled, the lives he destroyed, and the fear that gripped entire rural provinces mark Yang Xinhai as a haunting figure whose story remains one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Robert Hansen, a man whose actions terrorized Alaska for more than a decade. His crimes went undetected for years, and he managed to live among ordinary people while carrying out acts of unimaginable cruelty. Robert Hansen was born in 1939 in Esterville, Iowa. From the beginning, he was a quiet, introverted child. He suffered from frequent illnesses, including asthma, which kept him isolated from his peers and made social interaction difficult. His early childhood was marked by loneliness. He spent hours observing the world around him, especially the natural environment and animals. This fascination with hunting and firearms would shape his later life in profound ways. Even as a young boy, Hansen displayed disturbing tendencies. He had a fascination with trapping and harming animals. Neighbors and relatives later recalled incidents where he would set traps for small creatures, sometimes killing them without remorse. These behaviors were early warning signs of a lack of empathy and a fascination with control over weaker beings. In school, Hansen was often bullied and ostracized, deepening his sense of isolation. He retreated further into solitary activities, reading, observing, and imagining scenarios in which he held power over others. As a young man, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska. There, he pursued work as a baker, eventually opened his own small bakery. To the outside world, He appeared calm, polite, and respectable. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, professional man, unremarkable and trustworthy. This appearance of normalcy masked the dark compulsions that he harbored. Hansen's calm demeanor and attention to routine allowed him to operate unnoticed while he planned his crimes. Hansen's crimes began in the 1970s. He targeted women who were vulnerable, often sex workers or women alone in public areas. He would carefully observe potential victims, learning their routines and patterns. Using his van, he would lure them under the pretense of offering rides, jobs, or companionship. Once he gained control over them, he transported them to remote areas of the Alaskan wilderness. His knowledge of the land and hunting skills allowed him to select isolated locations where no one would find the victims. Once in the wilderness, Hansen's predatory instincts were fully revealed. He would restrain his victims and, in some cases, sexually assault them. In other cases, he would release them and pursue them through the forest, shooting at them as if they were game. He took pleasure in the fear and panic he created, viewing these women not as human beings, but as objects to dominate and hunt. His meticulous planning and patience made him extremely difficult to catch. He would often bury victims in unmarked graves, scatter evidence, and use the natural terrain to hide his crimes. The impact of his crimes on the community was profound, though it developed gradually. At first, disappearances were treated as isolated incidents. Families reported missing daughters, and friends searched in vain for answers. Women began to alter their behavior, avoiding certain areas and traveling in groups. The growing fear was subtle but pervasive. Law enforcement struggled to see the connection between cases. Hansen's careful selection of victims and his mobile approach allowed him to evade detection for years. Hansen's psychology was complex. Experts later determined that he had antisocial tendencies combined with sexual sadism. He was capable of maintaining a normal life, operating a business, and interacting with neighbors without raising suspicion. Yet privately, he acted on violent fantasies with meticulous calculation. He derived pleasure from exerting control over his victims and manipulating their fear. This duality, ordinary by day, predator by night, was central to his ability to continue for so long. Investigations into his crimes intensified in the early 1980s. A combination of forensic analysis, witness testimony, and law enforcement collaboration finally began to unravel his activities. One survivor provided crucial information that enabled authorities to identify Hansen. The pattern became evident. Vulnerable women were targeted, abducted, transported in his van, and disposed of in remote wilderness areas. Evidence included personal items belonging to victims, forensic traces, and eyewitness accounts of his interactions with women prior to abduction. Eventually, he was linked to at least 17 murders, though it is widely believed the number of victims may have been higher. Hansen's arrest in 1983 brought a wave of relief, but also horror as the details emerged. The trial revealed the full extent of his methodical cruelty. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including detailed accounts from surviving victims, physical evidence from crime scenes, and witness statements. Victims' families confronted Hansen in court, recounting years of fear and grief. Hansen maintained a composed, calm demeanor throughout the trial, showing little outward remorse. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of Hansen's crimes had a lasting effect on Alaska and beyond. Communities were forced to confront the vulnerabilities of women and the hidden dangers present even in quiet towns. Law enforcement agencies improved procedures for missing person cases, emphasized interagency cooperation, and advanced forensic and investigative techniques. Hansen's case became a prominent example in criminal psychology, illustrating the dangers posed by individuals capable of maintaining a normal facade while engaging in violent, compulsive behavior in private. Hansen remained in prison until his death in 2014. His story is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He hunted his victims like game, exploiting his knowledge of human behavior and the wilderness to evade capture. The terror he created, the lives he destroyed, and the fear that gripped entire communities make Robert Hansen one of the most haunting figures in the history of American crime. His crimes are studied not only for their brutality, but also for their lessons about vigilance, forensic investigation, and the hidden duality in human behavior. They remind us that appearances can be deceiving and that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary darkness. The story of Robert Hansen endures as a cautionary tale of methodical evil and the profound consequences of unchecked predatory impulses. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest and most unsettling crimes in Japanese history. It is the story of Miyuki Ishikawa, a woman who came to be called the Demon Midwife. In the years immediately after the Second World War, when Japan was struggling with poverty, hunger, and devastation, she was entrusted with the care of newborn children. Instead of protecting them, she oversaw their deaths. By the time her crimes were exposed, it was believed that dozens, perhaps more than 100 infants had perished under her watch, making her one of the most prolific killers in Japan's history. Her case shocked the country not only for its brutality, but also for what it revealed about the hardships of the era and the failures of system that allowed so many vulnerable lives to be lost. Miyuki Ishikawa was born in 1897 in southern Japan. She came of age in a period when the nation was rapidly modernizing, yet still deeply tied to traditional expectations. She received an education and eventually trained as a midwife, a respected profession that gave her authority within her community. By the 1940s, she had risen to a position of prominence, serving as director of a maternity hospital in Tokyo. Outwardly, she was seen as a responsible and skilled woman. In a society still heavily influenced by hierarchy and respect for authority, her role commanded trust. Parents believed they were leaving their newborns in safe hands. Few would have suspected that behind this professional image lay choices that would lead to mass death. The backdrop of her crimes is important. In the late 1940s, Japan was reeling from the devastation of the war. Cities had been bombed, the economy was in ruins, and food shortages were severe. Families struggled to provide for themselves, let alone for new children. At the same